Hello there, and welcome. Tonight we lean into a question that does not seek a verdict but invites a quiet imagining. How did humanity survive the Ice Age? Wherever you are, whether in daylight or darkness, among towers or trees or the gentle hush of a room, I hope you are comfortable, ready to let the mind drift like slow snow across an open plain. If this kind of soft wandering feels restful, would you like to stay, to follow along as curiosity moves at the pace of breath and the heart loosens into listening? Now, let's begin. The world is cold, and yet they breathe. Ice lies over continents. Like a paused ocean, ridges frozen mid-surge, a white memory shouldered by the mountains. It seems impossible at first that small, soft beings persist beneath such weight, but they do. They move like embers, guarded and patient, passed from hand to hand across generations. Humanity survives by carrying warmth, body heat, yes, but also the warmer fire of attention, the slow discipline of noticing what returns and what fades, what clouds the sky and what clears it, which cracks in the lake promise danger and which promise fish. In the present of deep time, glaciers advance, and retreat on a schedule no one writes and everyone inhabits. The tilt and wobble of the planet set long beats, and the ice answers with patience, thickening, thinning, cracking, singing. Valleys fill with blue-lit hush. Seas withdraw, bearing wide shelves like rooms revealed when a tide slips away. The air sharpens. Storms travel farther. Fields of wind-scrolled snow glitter under a sun that lingers near the horizon, more companion than ruler. They live within this littoral between freeze and flow, cultivating attention the way others might cultivate fields. Hearts slow, footsteps soften. In a season stretched across millennia, survival becomes less an event than a rhythm, an arrangement of habits tuned to a colder song. They stay near water because water is change. Ice thins in eddies, fish move beneath dark leads, reeds hold snow at a different angle and outline a sheltered lee. They bundle warmth as if it were sacred. Fire coaxed from tinder into glow, shelters, shaped against the wind, tools imagined as extensions of touch. Perhaps the greatest warmth is attention itself, a circle of faces turned toward the same small flame, patient enough to notice when it needs another breath. The cold does not shout, it settles, and over time it teaches a style of seeing that favors patience over conquest. They do not fight the ice, they lean with it, learning the way drifts curl around stones, the way ravens scatter along a valley as if sketching an invisible map, the way sunlight returns low and late, then leaves early, then lengthens again. Each observation becomes a question. What endures? What is rare? What can be trusted? In this attention, warmth accumulates as knowledge, and knowledge travels like a hand extended across winter. Hands enter snow and come up wet. Another hand holds flint and pyrite and releases a swarm of sparks. The Ice Age is often pictured as blank whiteness, yet even here color persists. Iron oxide reds, soot blacks, the deep gold of rendered fat, the translucent green of river ice swelling in thaw. They learn to read color as a map. Where lichens take hold, reindeer may pass. Where willows keep a thin line of catkins under wind-scoured banks, hares might browse. The world writes in small pigments, and they answer with small choices, each one a bead on a longer chain of staying alive. Bodies adapt in ways quiet and visible. Breath steams less when wool and hide cover the throat. Cheeks burn, then numb, then settle. Skin knows when to harden, when to crack, when to ask for grease. Infants sleep against chests that beat like muffled drums, their heat recycled, their weight anchoring a circle of care. The oldest remember routes that remain passable when the wind hammers for days. The youngest memorize the angle of stars, over a lake untroubled by smoke, Everyone belongs to a moving memory, a library not of pages but of paths, edible roots, currents under ice, and the way the sky smells before snow. They watch ice not as enemy, but as teacher of form. Snow cut and stacked becomes a luminous room where breath paints the ceiling and time changes sound. Bones stand as posts. Hides become portable horizons. In such architecture, the human body hears itself again. Footsteps rounding into hush, voices smoothing into almost whispers, a cradle of air warmed by a low lamp. The present tense of survival feels like meditation. Each small action, stitch, knot, spark, sip, counted slowly, aligned with the rhythm of the day so that nothing spills. What moves them onward? Part hunger, part curiosity, part light itself. The sun slides along a tilted arc and pulls shadows into thin rivers. They travel between them, not hurried, not idle, attentive to the grammar of cold. An animal track crosses, the depth shifting where a leg falters. They read the health of the herd in those hesitations. A bird loops against the wind. They read wind speed from the gesture. This is a literacy written in ice. It does not award glory. It rewards persistence, reminding them that to notice is to survive and to share what is noticed is to belong. Sometimes the ice gives back a gift. A seal surfaces in a lead, glossy and watchful. A driftwood rib washes ashore on a beach, newly unburied by the falling sea. A meteorite lies dark on a white field. Iron waiting inside like a seed. With patience they learn that even a hard world has thresholds. Winter presses, yet the world still turns. Somewhere to the south a valley stays damp and green. Somewhere, to the north, open water gleams. Animals move along these margins like unknowing guides, and they move, too, with humility, gathering the openings the season permits. They share. The word is modest, yet it may be the central fire. Meat passes from hand to hand. Stories pass, too, not as declarations but as questions tied to places. Where does the river split when the first geese come? Where does ice grow treacherous after the moon swells? A story that remembers a safe crossing can be as warm as fat in a lean season. A lullaby that counts the stars may keep a baby sleeping and a watcher awake long enough to feed the lamp. Generosity becomes a technology refined by winter, reliable, portable, renewable. Evidence of their days drifts thin across time. Hearth ash, a worked point, a strand of sinew hardened into a stitch. The record is quiet, yet quiet is not empty. Perhaps survival prefers modest archives. A smudge on a cave wall could be a calendar of animals. A line of stones could be a windbreak. A scatter of shells on a high terrace could be a shoreline that no longer exists. A picnic in a world where the sea stands far away. They leave enough and not too much, as if the land itself wishes to travel light. The question remains, held as one holds a coal in a twist of bark. How do they endure a planet wrapped in ice? Perhaps by not insisting on a single answer. They survive by letting warmth take many forms: fire, shelter, clothing, memory, ritual, and the agreement to share what is scarce without breaking the group. They survive because they understand themselves as threads in a wider fabric that includes storm and stone, prey and predator, ancestor and the unborn. They survive by learning, slowly, that the earth is not against them, even when it is cold. Beyond speech, it is simply vast, asking for respect, inviting listening. Night gathers. The cold earth breathes under patient stars. A thin cloud glows, an aurora sighs along a magnetic line, and somewhere a small flame steadies in cupped hands. They pass that flame from one to another, and the line of light extends into the long. Dark. Warmth travels. Wonder travels. In the traveling, A species leans through winter toward a future it cannot see, holding together, listening, matching its breath to the slow patience of ice, and walking. Fire begins as a tremble, a hush that glows. On a plain where cold presses from every direction, a few fibers catch, a curl of smoke rises, and a small, patient flame opens like a flower that chooses the night. They gather along the edge of ice, along the edges of rivers, windbreaks, and caves, those seams where two worlds touch and make room for warmth to take hold. If survival writes its earliest maps, the ink is ember red, and the landmarks are circles of light pressed gently into darkness. A hearth is not only heat, it is a place. Stones lean in a ring the way shoulders tilt around a shared thought. Ash banks the slow heart of fire so it can be found again at dawn. A flat slab grows warm. A pot of snow exhales into water. Fat softens into shine. The glow lengthens bones into shadows that sway like reeds, and in that sway a rhythm emerges, steadying breath, setting the cadence of a winter evening. They learn to tend this rhythm as one tends a promise. Add fuel before need becomes emergency. Stir coals so the hidden red can breathe. Shelter the flame from a gust with the hollow of a hand. Sometimes a strike of pyrite on flint unlocks a swarm of sparks. Often, the wiser choice is to carry yesterday forward. A coal wrapped in ash, a smoldering pellet of fungus tucked like a sleeping heart in a pouch, a stone lamp whose wick sips, tallow while feet search for a suitable lee. Fuel becomes a quiet art. On coasts, driftwood arrives like a message from distant forests, salted, dense, catalogued by touch. On treeless steppe, the menu shifts. Shrubs and roots dried under eaves of hide, peat peeled in thin bricks from the marsh edge, dung that burns with a steady, dusty heat. Even old bone, when coaxed, gives a long blue flame that does not flare, but endures. Scarcity teaches patience, and patience becomes technique, and technique becomes a kind of confidence that remains humble. Cooking is chemistry braided with care. Snow becomes water, water becomes broth, and broth carries the gathered world inward. Meat softens, collagen unwinds, marrow warms to a golden gloss that seals cracks in wind-burned hands and feeds the tired brain. Roots surrender starch that heat unlocks, seeds release oils, bitter leaves mellow into food. Even in lean times, a thin soup stirred slowly can steady a night's breath. Smoke threads through hides and hair, both preservative and signature, a small perfume of persistence. Heat, like kindness, changes the texture of what it touches. Light is a teacher. In firelight, eyes travel slowly across surfaces, reading the gleam on a blade's edge, the faint crack where a haft will need new binding, the pale seam in a hide that asks for a softer stitch. Shadows enlarge small gestures into ceremonies. A hand offering meat becomes a message about belonging. A child sleeping by the coals becomes a vow to the future. Plans spoken near the flames do not rush. They settle into the ash with a weight that is practical and gentle at once. Evidence of these evenings drifts forward through time in delicate forms. There is a lens of charcoal beneath a layer of pale dust, a circle of reddened soil where heat altered minerals, a scatter of burned bone with pores widened by flame. There is soot traced on stone, a ceiling that remembers smoke in faint black. Blooms, a lamp with a lip polished by fat and by fingers. The record does not boast. It whispers. Someone sat here quietly. Someone warmed their hands. Someone watched a child sleep and kept the coals alive until morning. The cold shapes more than shelter. It shapes attention. Around a low flame, the human day lengthens gently into night without closing. Tasks slip into conversation. Conversation dissolves into shared silence. The timbre of talk changes. The way wind sounds different after snow. Stories arise not as performances, but as tools. A recollection of where willow bark peels thin for cordage, a tale of the year the ice broke early and fish moved under cloudy water, a reminder that generosity is a form of insulation. Fires. Physics hum in the background like a lullaby sung by the world. What burns is stored sunlight, sugars threaded into wood by a season that now sleeps under snow. As flame unwinds those sugars, heat returns to the night, light returns to faces, and water vapor lifts as a white plume that later draws frost lace on a hide door. Far away, the sun fuses elements and sends energy outward. Here, a spark unties. A bundle of carbon, and the energy comes home in a language lungs can understand. When the wind roars, the hearth murmurs. Stay. When hunger leans in, the hearth answers. Share. A group becomes a single breathing body, and the fire its pulsing core. Each person takes a turn at the edge, fetching fuel, tending coals, stepping into night to feel the temperature drop and the snow's texture change underfoot. Roles rotate like stars around a slow axis. In that rotation they find continuity. Even grief sits with them at the fire and is given a place where its weight can soften. Some traces vanish with the snow. Some enter the soil as memory. A blackened patch the size of a cloak, a rim of reddened stones, a cluster of tiny fish bones cracked for their marrow. These become the most modest archives. Yet modesty suits a species that lasts by not insisting. The lesson widens with the glow. Keep the flame small enough to carry, large enough to share. Let warmth trace the edges and make them livable. Let light teach the hands what to do. The night does not end because a fire burns. It becomes habitable. Stars keep their slow counsel. The river beneath its lid of ice continues moving, whispering to the banks. The wind rearranges small dunes of snow around the windbreak. And there, in the middle of so much motion and cold, a single flame remembers the ancient itinerary of heat, from distant sun to plant to wood to hand to breath, until the map in ash and ember glows softly enough to guide another step along the edge. Shelter grows from attention. Wind arrives like an invisible sculptor, tracing lines across snow, combing grasses flat, teaching which shapes will last and which will fray. They watch, patient, and learn to build the way dunes build, leeward, curved, without sharpness that invites the gust to pry. A wall becomes a softened shoulder, a roof, a drift persuaded to stay. In winter, architecture turns into listening, a conversation carried in currents rather than in words. Stone answers first. Rocks absorb the day and release it slowly at night, a small tide of stored sun that steadies breath. Low rings of stone grow in arcs that echo the way wind curls around a boulder. A hide stretched on a frame leans into the lee, its surface oiled to shrug off snow that presses to become water and then ice. The entrance turns away from the prevailing mood of the sky. Inside, the air calms. Outside, the plain flows on. Snow, paradoxical, warms, not because it burns, but because it holds air in 1,000 small chambers. They cut blocks where the wind has hardened the surface, stack them into a low dome, and knead soft snow into the seams. The curve carries force downward. The joints lock. The world beyond howls while inside voices fall to a hush. A shallow trench by the doorway gathers dense, chilled air. The sleeping platform, raised by a hand's breadth, rests in a pocket of comfort where breath can slow and listen. Where trees are sparse, bone serves as forest. Mammoth ribs arc like beams pre-sprung to accept the weight of weather. Tusks shape doorways. Skull and scapula stack into windbreaks that remember the bodies they once guarded. With sinew and rawhide, they lash a lattice and drape it with hides, stitched into a single wide skin, weighted with stones, tucked with care. Shelter reads as gratitude. Nothing wasted, everything returning. After a storm, the hide darkens and then gleams, its surface speaking of weather and care. Cave mouths offer a different grammar. South-facing, they sip light without drinking wind. Temperatures inside hold steady, seasons smoothed by depth and mass. The back wall keeps secrets. The foreground hosts fire. Smoke drifts along the ceiling and writes a dark line that, years later, remembers that air. Drips mark time in stalactite. Syllables. Bats add a soft punctuation of sleep. Here, shelter is both home and echo, a chamber whose form is older than the hands that warm it. On coasts, houses sink partly into earth, letting soil shoulder the blow. Whalebone, when the ocean grants it, crooks into arches. An oceanic rhyme. To the steps' mammoth geometry. Sod dresses the roof with roots that knit and clutch. Entrances tunnel low and narrow. Warmth lays down in the main room like a resting animal and stays. A small skylight lets smoke drift upward even as weather presses down. Lamps sip oil. Wet gloves steam and then quiet. The night grows usable. Placement matters as much as form. A south slope invites winter sun. A north bank promises summer cool. A line of willow can catch drifting snow to thicken a windbreak. No house is isolated. Each converses with its surroundings. Brush screens against blowing white. Moss tucked in seams mutes drafts. A floor of woven reeds lifts sleep above seepage. If an animal trail leans too close, they adjust. If an ice lens forms underfoot, they move hearth and bed. Tools attend to this architecture with quiet pride. A bone awl pierces hide without tearing. A needle threads sinew that tightens as it drees. Pegs whittled from antler resist, splitting under strain. Cordage spun from bast carries a memory of spring even in deepest winter. They weatherproof with fat and smoke, with fine ochre rubbed into seams as both pigment and protection. Iron-rich. Grains filling small gaps the way patience fills the space between storms. The house is never finished. It is always becoming. Light inside is deliberate. The lamp sits low, its wick cut from plants that remember summer marshes. Reflected against. A pale slab, the glow doubles gently, enough to sew, enough to carve. A cache of tinder stays dry as a vow. The room's vocabulary grows familiar. The hiss when snow meets warm stone, the faint creak when sinew tightens at night, the small rain of frost that falls from the roof at dawn. They measure safety in breaths. Venting matters, though the word is not spoken. A low opening near the floor draws in tempered air. A higher gap above the lamp lets exhalations go. Openings shrink when the sky grows hard, widen when many gather. Hands feel for leaks the way one reads a face. Where the wind finds a seam, they answer with moss. Another stitch, a stone adjusted by 2 fingers. The cold is precise. They match it note for note, keeping the fire small and bright, the air sweet and sufficient. When spring loosens the ground, shelters migrate or molt. Poles rise from their sockets. Hides fold along creases polished by many winters. Bones return to caches with the solemnity given to tools that once were lives. A camp reduces to a trace. The dark oval of a house ring, a scatter of tiny flakes from keen-edged stone, a refuse pit with fish scales flashing like seeds. Grass writes over the memory without erasing it. To endure a long winter is not only to last but to leave lightly. Each design holds a philosophy. The dome trusts curvature. The cave trusts depth. The pit house trusts the earth. The bone house trusts reciprocity. All trust the wind enough to converse rather than defy. The lesson is soft. Comfort is not conquest, but choreography. An agreement between body, material, and weather to move together. When a storm stands on the plain, shelter bows. When calm returns, shelter opens. Night deepens. The house hums like a held breath. A sleeping skin warms beneath a palm. A spark winks in the lamp. Outside, the dune continues its slow migration past the door, attentive to the same wind the builders obey. Somewhere, a rib creaks and settles. Somewhere, the moss in a seam drinks a drop that slid through a stitch and swells contentedly, plugging a tiny river. The storm speaks and is answered. The answer is shelter, carved from wind, tuned to weather, temporary in form yet durable in wisdom. Clothing becomes weather, softly negotiable. A needle flashes once in lamplight, and the world around a body changes. Wind slows, snow slides away instead of clutching, warmth lingers like a small domestic animal that chooses to stay. They learn to carry a microclimate with them, a second, skin shaped by patience and by the quiet physics of trapped air. The work begins before the stitch. Hides open under careful hands like maps that must be read as they are made. Scrapers, stone or bone with edges honed by many evenings, loosen, fat and membrane until the surface grows supple and clean. Brain and smoke lend chemistry that bodies understand. Oils emulsify and slide into fibers. Aldehydes drift in from the fire and crosslink, and the raw pelt becomes something that bends without breaking, resists water without refusing breath. A hide stretched on a frame creaks as it dries, the sound like a small door in a steady wind. They rub in, fat again, pull again, sing to the rhythm of the pulling without calling it song. Fur itself carries a curriculum. Some hair is hollow and buoyant, catching air the way down catches light. Some hair is dense and smooth, sheathing a garment against sleet. They study direction, the lie of nap. A hood stitched with fur turned outward lets snow bead and run. Boots with fur turned inward capture softness where bones meet earth. They align pieces not just for fit, but for flow, so that moving through, the storm feels less like opposition and more like being accompanied by a helpful medium. The needle, small as a wish, changes everything. With an eye to lead thread, it turns a hide into tailored weather rather than a drape. Bone tapers to a point that slides, not tears. Antler, sometimes bird bone, sometimes ivory where the shore offers it, each holds a curve that fingers remember. In the dark, sinew becomes thread. Backstrap teased into slender strands, twisted, wetted, and rolled. As it dries in a seam, it shrinks, pulling edges together with a memory of its former tension. Stitches follow logic learned from water. Overlaps. That shed seams that do not gather snow, turns that do not invite wind to pry. Pieces multiply like thoughtful layers of thought. An inner shirt, a tunic, leggings that lace, a parka whose hood frames a private weather, mittens paired by a long cord that runs across the shoulders so loss is less likely. Boots become a system. Outer shell that resists wet, inner liner that loves warmth, insoles of bark or grass that wick and breathe. Dry grasses, combed and twisted, make a soft thatch inside footwear, replaced as needed, teaching that comfort is an ongoing decision, not a single act. They learn to manage moisture as carefully as heat. Snow brushed away at the door does not melt, against fabric. Ice knocked from hems will not drink body warmth to change state. On travel days, garments loosen slightly to slow sweat, because dampness steals warmth faster than wind. At night, boots sleep near the fire but not too near. Steam rises, then fades. A palm tests the line between dry and brittle. The house becomes a wardrobe of states of matter, ice softening to water, water lifting to vapor, each tended with the courtesy given to guests. Plant fibers enter where the land offers them. Bark in spring peels in sheets that, split and spun, turn into cord and net. Roots coil into lines that bind and reinforce. Nets hold fish but also cradle stones that weight hems. Twined grasses edge a hood so that frost gathers there first, like a sacrificial crest. Even in treeless places, a few tough stems become a patient vocabulary of ties and laces, loops that fingers can find when light is low. Some garments resist rain by being almost transparent. Gut, cleaned until it gleams like river ice and dried into long ribbons, sews into a sheath that whispers when the wearer moves. It keeps out wet and lets out breath. In a snowstorm, such a coat plays a thin music, a rustle that says, "Inside." A climate persists. Bird skins feather together for weightless warmth. Fish skin, with its quiet scales, learns to be a boot that knows water as a friend and not a thief. Eyes learn to read stitch as sentence. A running seam invites flex. A backstitch holds torque. An overfold sheds. A hidden hem adds kindness to a cuff where wrist meets edge. The needle holes themselves matter. Too large and wind learns the grammar. Too small, and the seam resists. The garment's living expansion. They pierce on the bias, angling threads so fabric moves like a body does. Over time, a coat knows the shoulders that wear it. An elbow remembers the angle of a habitual task. In this mutual remembering, clothing becomes a companion intelligence. Adornment arrives not to boast but to belong. Beads, bone, shell, tusk, shaved thin, travel to the edge of a hood where they rattle softly and keep frost from settling. A fringe wicks melt away. A line of tiny, laborious ornaments sewn along a hem may speak of patience, kinship, gratitude to the animal that became, warmth, pigments, dust seams, not only for beauty but to mark lines that future mending will follow. What is called art can also be maintenance. What is called function can carry joy. Clothing extends the body's say in the conversation with cold. Physiology supplies blood, shiver, vessel narrowing and widening. Garments give those efforts a stage. Trapped air slows conduction, baffles tame convection. Fibers that still breathe let evaporation do its work without stealing too much heat. The human boundary layer, thin air warmed by skin, learns to stay, stroked and respected by well-cut cloth. A hood shapes the wind into an eddy instead of a blade. A ruff of fur breaks the flow and keeps a small warm pool at the face where words can form and be heard. Tools for tending the second skin become small treasures. A needle case keeps edges safe and points keen. Hollow bone, a slip of bark, a wrap of soft hide tied with a loop trained to remember tightness. A thimble of leather saves a thumb. A whetstone for awls lives near the lamp like an extra star. These are quiet luxuries, not in the sense of excess but of intention. Time spent now so that tomorrow does not fray. Mending is a ceremony without drama. A tear appears where a branch reached out. A cuff thins from honest use. A patch carries yet a story. This piece from the deer that fed us in early winter. That thread twisted while we waited out a storm. A garment grows older without growing mean. It softens, adjusts, remembers, and in remembering, it keeps teaching the hands that care for it. Children watch the angle of the needle, the rhythm, pull, breathe, cinch, smooth, and someday their hands fall into that same patient metronome. Even vision receives a garment. Snow glares. Eyes ache. A strip of bone or wood or hide, slit to a narrow horizon, sits on the face like a thoughtful rule and reduces light to a tender band. The world narrows, then clarifies. In that restraint, distance becomes readable again. The ridge, the lead, the shape of a drift that means the wind will turn after noon. Protection in this world often arrives as a narrowing that makes seeing possible. The second skin teaches reciprocity. Animals give warmth that becomes shelter. Around a human heart. In return, people give attention that keeps animals from being squandered. Plants twist into ties and lines, and in return, people leave seeds intact, roots respected. The garments take from many and then give back in the form of lives continued. Gratitude is not spoken much. It is sewn into seams, rubbed into leather, worn into the shine on a hood where a hand has pressed 1,000 times in weather. Out on the ice, the wind rises, tests, then gives up. A figure moves steady, small weather wrapped around larger weather, a portable habitat whose walls are stitch and fiber and knowledge passed hand to hand. The storm does not stop. The person does not stop. Between them, an understanding holds. The second skin, faithful, makes a climate where breath stays warm, where fingers remain clever, where the long journey can stay gentle. Sea retreats, and the earth exhales a secret. Where waves once write their restless cursive, the tide pulls. Back for centuries, revealing floors the sun has not touched in an age. They step onto the new wide rim of the world and leave marks in silts that remember every pressure. Footprints press down, heel, then toe, a line of lives walking where later fishes will turn. For a while, long for a person, brief for a planet, the continental shelves lift their pale faces to the sky and become country. A shoreline does not stand still. It migrates with the ice, with winds that feed or deny the ice, with the long tilt and wobble that draw oceans up and let them down. During cold peaks, water stores itself as high white ranges, and the sea rests lower by the height of a cliff. Where soundings later deepen, now meadows green. Rivers lengthen, stitching across the new plain toward an edge still many days' walk away. Estuaries open like hands, their fingers creeks and lagoons, and low dunes learn the grammar of wind. They live on the margin because the margin is generous. Tide pools lay out menus. Kelp forests become slow roads, home to fish that move in schools like weather. Seals blink at frost and share it. Birds land in crowds and lift like smoke. These broad, exposed shelves, camps rise on dunes stabilized by tough grasses, on bluffs where wind carves alcoves, beside channels where fish wait for the moon to change the height of water. Smoke threads across horizons that will be water again. The open plain meets the open sea and calls it home. Rivers write long stories when the sea falls. Channels cut deep into the shelf and end in sudden canyons where the continental edge drops like a thought unfinished. When water returns and floods this story, the old river mouths remain as ghost lines, traced by currents and sand waves. If one could walk there now, between corals that like the new depth, past anchors asleep in silt, one might feel the lay of a valley underfoot, the curve where water once curved, the firmness of a ford now far beneath tides. Evidence of their days. On these plains does not love the future. Much is built from what the sea reclaims most easily: wood, grass, fiber, hide. Waves abrade, small lives taste, salts rearrange. Storms read the record and rewrite it in scours and dunes. Yet not everything forgets. A hearth reddens sand and bakes it into memory. A pile of shell accumulates where meals were shared and becomes a low mound that survives as geology. A stone point, lost or placed, waits among ripples until a trawl draws it into daylight for a startled eye to hold. Sometimes the memory is more intimate. Blue caves along a limestone coast drink the sea as it rises and seal old doorways in water clear as glass. Inside, in pockets of air, a few bones sleep on floors that once were dry. A footprint remains where clay held it. Toe marking, arch delicate, the sudden lovely specificity of a step that becomes the only sentence left from a day whose weather cannot be reconstructed. In such places, time composes small altars to movement and pause, and the ocean stands as a patient guard. Language tries to follow. Do stories of great floods keep a weathered echo of coasts returning to the sea? Perhaps a people who live long beside a mutable boundary learn to speak of. transience without despair. The shoreline is a teacher of humility, a line that says both come closer and be ready to move. They build light so they can lift and go. They cache what cannot travel. They walk with the sea, parallel, listening for its plans, noticing where driftwood gathers and where saltgrass changes color before a storm. The shelves, wide and green in cold time, invite experiments in living. Where the water shallows far from the old cliffs, they try boats that are more skin than wood, more patience than weight. A paddle tests the surface and finds it responsive. Nets tethered to stones understand the tide as collaborator. Camps face east, where the sun rises over land that is now ocean. Freshwater lenses accumulate in dunes. A well dug an arm's depth offers sweet water on a plain bordered by salt. Children learn that the horizon is not a wall, but a question. Far away, on another shelf, the sea leaves a land bridge long enough for a season measured in centuries. Herds pass, people follow. Marsh becomes steppe, and between the old islands an isthmus grows, a braided convergence of roots. They do not know they are walking across a future sea. They know only that wind smells of salt, and that on clear days the horizon shows a dark line that is not cloud. In this crossing, fear does not lead, attention does. Later, when water climbs, again, and the bridge thins to a ribbon, attention leads home by a higher path. On coasts everywhere, the proof of these umbilical plains is partly absence. The earliest camps, richest with fish bones and woven with nets and baskets, would have loved the edges. Those edges now lie offshore. Archaeology walks the present land and finds later traces first, and so the story looks more inland than it once was. Yet engineers mapping seafloor for cables, fishers drawing curious objects from nets, divers finding drowned forests upright in quiet bays, each adds a point to a constellation that sketches a vanished shore. Sea level does not climb. As an even tide, it pulses. Ice melts in fits and starts. Shorelines leap landward when a dam of ice gives way. Then they rest while the planet rearranges its weight and the crust rises where the heavy cold has departed. In low places, water pours through straits that did not exist the century before. Fresh water dilutes a basin and changes its life. Salt pushes back and remakes it again. Through all this, people are not passive. They move camps upslope. They learn the new bathymetry by listening to waves. What sleeps beneath the waves is not only artifact but arrangement. Villages set high enough to catch a breeze. Fish weirs laid from stone in patterns that look decorative from the future's sky. Causeways across marsh made of brush and clay. Lines of posts that once held a walkway, now a reef where anemones open like small hands. It is possible to imagine a whole grammar of shoreline life written down there beneath the white noise of surf, a library in silt. Perhaps it is enough for now to know that the book exists whether or not it is read. They return to the present and stand on a modern shore. Wind salt sweetens the air. The line of breakers marks the place where history and geology keep meeting to renegotiate. Somewhere beyond that line lies a meadow where a child once watched a fox vanish into grass, a hearth where someone traded a story for a piece of dried fish, a well ringed with shells because someone liked the way they gleamed. None of this asks to be owned. It asks to be imagined, to be held lightly, to be given the quiet honor of attention. The tide turns. Waves lean in with their patient hands and work at the sand. Footprints fill, then vanish. The ocean does what oceans do: carry, polish, return. The shelf keeps its counsel, content to be country in one age and seafloor in another. People, for their part, keep learning the shape of staying near a moving border, light on the land, loyal to each other, curious about what lies just under, the next wave. Rivers move like long thoughts, slow where they can be, swift where they must, braiding and unbraiding across pale sand. In an age of cold, they become moving spines that hold the land together, carrying meltwater from high ice to low seas, carrying fish from salt to fresh and back again, carrying people who learn the river's verbs by traveling inside them. They do not hurry. They watch for the faint lines where water divides and for the convergences where many small threads become one bright course, and they make their camps where listening is easiest. A river begins at a margin, the foot of a glacier where melt drips, in lucid syllables, the side of a mountain where snow surrenders by degrees. In deep cold, the flow narrows, glazing into lanes of quiet. In thaw, it multiplies, splitting around bars, braid after braid drawn by sediment that light appraises and then sets down. Proglacial streams carry groundstone, a flower of ice-worked rock that turns water the color of milk. The river writes and erases in the same gesture, carving a side channel one week and abandoning it the next, rehearsing its own future like a patient musician testing phrases. They understand that a braided channel is both promise and warning. It promises crossings, shallows where a staff finds the bottom and feels for pull. It warns that the bottom moves. Bars shift in a single storm. A ford becomes a trap by morning. So they test with poles, watch the angle of foam, note where willow, roots hold and where sedges lean. They read tones of water the way others read ink. A pale riffle means stones just under the skin. A dark, quiet lane means depth and a faster thread. A crossing is less a place than a mood, a brief truce between gravity and silt. Rivers are roads twice over. In winter, freeze knits the surface into a corridor smooth as in tension. Sleds sing on it, and the night carries that thin song for miles. They travel then with the grain of the land, cargo sliding where it wishes to slide. Spring breaks the spell with a sound like bones loosening. Ice bucks and stacks, then lets go, and travel changes to patience. In summer, boats take the path, skin-on-frame hulls that lift to a fingertip, dugouts where trees are generous, rafts where the valley yields straight trunks. Portages stitch the wet segments together. A shoulder accepts the weight as if accepting, a sentence to be spoken later. The fish write their own schedule into the flow. Salmon return, fat with the sea's stored light, their bodies a slow, shimmering harvest. Eulachon, lamprey, trout, char, names from many latitudes for oily and lean, for seasons that taste different. They gather at constrictions where the channel narrows its speech, riffles, mouths of side streams, places where stones make a music that can be read by a net. Weirs of stone and brush turn the current into a conversation, guiding fish toward baskets that wait with patient throats. The river does not empty, it participates, and people match its generosity with restraint. The harvest is careful. Grease is rendered and kept in skin bags that clink softly together when moved. Fish split and hung on racks darken and then lighten as wind and sun work. Some flesh is smoked, some is fermented in earth-lined pits that remember past seasons and hold, the next against hunger. Bones return to the water or to the bank to feed the place that fed them. Children learn to count by the rhythm of philose, by the quiet arithmetic of sharing. This for the elders, this for the journey, this to stay as a promise against winter that has not yet spoken. The river trades in more than meat. Salmon carry the ocean upstream in their bodies, nutrients, a sea salt memory that feeds the valley when those bodies return to soil. Bears help, birds help, people help, without naming it help. Above the banks, the willows thicken. Birch leaves glow a brighter green, and berry canes promise later sweetness. By following fish, people follow fertility, pitching camps where the years tend to converge into plenty. A year without a run does not undo the practice. The racks stand anyway, and the watch is kept, because attention itself is part of the food. They learn to read the river as a calendar and compass. The first silver flickers at dusk mean the moon is almost full. Water colder than air in late summer writes its breath as mist at dawn and tells sleepers what kind of day to expect. When the level drops and exposes a ledge, another week remains, before the peak. When a flood bites fresh into the bank and topples a birch, the channel announces next year's revision. Children point not at the water alone, but at the valley, how the slopes hold snow, how the wind carves banners in spruce, how the cloud shadow walks downstream like a messenger. Along these spines, kinship spreads. Travel is easier on water, and news moves with rafts and with feet on frozen lanes. A gesture of greeting becomes standard along a drainage. A word for riffle echoes valley to valley with small changes. Tool styles converge where people gather to fish at a narrows. Generosity thickens. Dried fish travels inland to those who live among grasses and stone. Stone, suitable for edges, travels back down to those who lack it. The river's commerce is not coin, but reciprocity, bundled in baskets and spoken as hospitality. Danger participates, without malice. Ice jams lift the water suddenly and ask houses to climb. Silt hides a hole where a foot expects ground. In spring, bank slumps wake at night with a sigh and take a sleeping place down with them. So they site camps on bars that look old, on terraces with willow of a certain thickness, where drift marks say the worst flood in memory stopped a hand's breadth below this stone. Boats are tied with rope that can be cut in a hurry. Children, learn the rule that a river deserves distance even when it looks asleep. Tools lean toward the current's preferences. Nets not wide or fine depending on clarity. Basket traps narrow toward their throat so fish can enter easily and find exit. Unlikely. Harpoon heads toggle turning crosswise so the pull does not tear out. Lines braid from roots or inner bark, strong when wet, stronger when dried, and always coiled with the respect given to anything that holds lives. Even hooks carved from bone carry a small grace, a curve learned from the jaw of a fish and from the arc of a fingertip. Everything that touches water accepts the lesson of give. Floodplain soils keep a quiet invitation. When the river oversteps its banks, it lays a thin, silty gift that later grasses enjoy. In warmer belts or warmer centuries, small gardens flirt with the edge, tubers tucked into loam where spring flood left its sign, seeds scratched into damp. The river is not farmed so much as courted. In colder belts, willow and alder coppice themselves under cutting and return straight and useful. Shelters rise where driftwood lodges year after year, where the current's generosity stacks its offerings like a discreet market at dawn. Some rivers carve canyons and become teachers of scale. Their walls explain layered time better than any, telling old sands hardened to stone, volcanic ash pressed into paper-thin bands, a fossil shell resting far from any tide. Others meander on wide floodplains, lounging like animals at ease. A few vanish into sink and spring, speaking an underground dialect and reappearing clear and cold a day's walk away. All travel toward the same end and never arrive, because the ocean returns them as sky. Watching their cycle, people learn that revision is not loss but rhythm, and that home can migrate and still be home. At night, the river listens to the stars and repeats their slow order in ripples. A lamp on the bank answers with its own small constellation. Fish turn once and sleep. The boat's skin cools. Somewhere upstream, the glacier settles with a sound like distant thunder, and a little more water begins the long descent. They sleep close to the current because the current says tomorrow out loud. In the morning, they will read it again. Depth by color, speed by the talk against stones, seasoned by smell, and set their steps or their paddles to its patient grammar, trusting a spine of water to carry them through the cold. They look for the places that keep a quiet summer. In a vast dominion of frost, refugia gather like small, stubborn lanterns, mossy valleys where wind loses its edge, southward slopes that sip low sun and hold it, cliff feet that bask in reflected light as if stones were gentle hearths. The cold is not uniform. It ripples and leaves eddies. Inside those eddies, green lingers, water continues to move, and lives stitch themselves together with threads too fine for maps, but strong enough for a wintering species to follow. South faces are teachers. Snow thins there first, peeling back in scallops that reveal the brown script of last year's grasses and the dark gloss of wet soil. Rock warms and then gives warmth back. In the afternoon, a hand laid to a boulder reads a small sunset. Shrubs huddle low, willow, dwarf birch, juniper, pressing their leaves close to the earth where air moves more slowly. A hare prints a delicate line across the thawing patch, and behind the hare, the first herbs lift their small promises into wind that now feels less like a blade and more like breath. Valleys learn the art of shelter. Where ridges lean together and turn their shoulders to the worst of the weather, a microclimate forms, quiet and particular. Springs open in the seam, water rising from a depth so patient it forgets the day's temperature. Around the spring, the year turns earlier and ends later. In the morning, fog lifts like a slow curtain, and the ground stays pliant, smelling of iron and green. They camp on benches above the floor, where cold air does not settle at night, where the lamp's smoke threads upward and finds easy exit. Inversions write a lesson that bodies memorize. Sometimes the warmth is not lowest, but somewhere in the middle, a thermal belt banding the slope like an invisible sash. Stone overhangs become mild houses without walls. Sunlight, grazing low, slips in beneath the lip of rock and lingers. The air there tastes less metallic. A crust on a pool skims thinner and cracks earlier. Even talus breathes a tempered draft, the deep heap of stones cooling and warming with a lag, exhaling air that is not as harsh as the wind above. They feel for such exhalations the way one feels for water in a dry land, and they take note. Here the berries redden first. Here the lichens never wholly sleep. Here a nest survives. A storm that scoured the far bank bare. Refugia are more than plant lists. They are economies. Where green persists, insects persist. Where insects persist, birds add their small, bright hunger. Herbivores linger and return. A line of reindeer learns that a certain saddle stays open. A certain creek mouth never fully locks. People read these rehearsals of survival and keep time with them. The first bees, few and drowsy, wake around a south-facing rock and find flowers cautious but brave. Later in summer, thimble-sized berries shine among cushions of moss with a sweetness that tastes like a stored memory of sun. Those sugars move, through bodies like a soft instruction. Keep going. Elsewhere, the ocean composes its own warm pockets. Along winter coasts, dark leads of open water open in the ice, polynyas that breathe in the cold, steaming like large animals. Here, seals surface, birds stitch the sky, and hunters step along an edge that is paradoxically both severe and generous. The sea feeds the air above it with gentler temperatures. Cliffs near such openings nurse grasses that the wind would otherwise deny. A camp near this living margin hears two kinds of water at once: the small, busy wave against the flow, the deep, slow pulse of swell beyond. Warmth, again, is relative, local, sufficient. Volcanic places carry heat even when the world is most austere. A fumarole's damp breath keeps a circle of ground bare. Springs rise already tempered by the planet's internal patience and remain liquid when everything else sets. In these rings the year refuses to halt. Moss grows as if listening to a quieter calendar. People come not to worship, but to learn. Steam softens hides. Warm water persuades sinew to yield to a needle. Stones baked near vents become early ovens for roots that winter hid. Even miles away, where no steam shows, basalt and black sand. Drink sun and release it after dusk, easing the edge of evening. On windswept plains, soil itself offers shelter in miniature. Low hills born of glacial dust stand pale and quick to drain. A thin skin of meltwater slips through instead of staying to freeze the surface into steel. On their faces, steppe herbs lift early, and rodents carve steady tunnels where air is stable and food can be cached. Foxes remember these pockets. So do the people who track foxes with their eyes more than their feet, reading the narrative of paw and shade and the faint, acrid punctuation of scent on a stone. They learn that a refuge does not have to be large to be decisive. A hollow the size of a cloak. A hollow warmed each morning by a light that only enters at a certain angle. A shelf where winter's last drift releases water drop by ordered drop. A ledge under a south nose of rock where the lamp, sheltered from wind, burns smaller and brighter. In great winters, these places do not save everyone. They save enough again and again until enough becomes a lineage. Evidence of these pockets rides forward through quiet means. Pollen settles in lakes each year and keeps a layered diary of what bloomed where the wind allowed it. Beetle cases, iridescent and tough, outlast the bodies that wore them and testify to temperatures within a few finger widths of comfort. In dry caves, pack rats use the scraps they admire, leaves, petals, fibers, and preserve with urine a catalog that a future can read. None of this is loud. It is incremental memory, a chorus of small archivists confirming what hands already know, that the ice sheet has edges, that edges have rooms inside them. Human refugia mirror the botanical. Stories collect where warmth collects. Words for south and lee and break in the wind acquire flavors and proverbs. A gesture points not at the sun but at the understanding of its low arc. Techniques dwell in pockets, too. In one valley, a particular way of netting thrives because it fits a local current that never quite freezes. In another, a certain stitch endures because hides there dry with a peculiar tenderness. Over ages, lineages coil within these niches, keeping a genetic memory parallel to the cultural one, both waiting patiently for the general thaw. The ethics of winter also find refuge. Generosity blooms where scarcity presses most, almost as if the social warmth tightens its weave where the air would like to pull it apart. A small, dependable spring becomes a place where rules settle. Who draws first, who carries water for those who cannot, who monitors the ice slip in wind. Gratitude, too, locates itself geographically. A recurring gift from the land invites a recurring answer in behavior, ritual without theater. Hands pause at the spring's edge. Fat is set aside for lamps near a cave that always stays calm. A branch is left unbroken so birds can return to it. They move between pockets the way bees move between flowers, never emptying one before seeking the next, never assuming that a refuge owes them more than they can carry lightly. Pathways that link them become knowledge with the feel of marrow, internal and warm. A map, if drawn, would look like constellations, small lights connected by lines of remembered distance. Yet the paper would be unnecessary. The body knows. The eye scans a slope and says here. The foot tests a crust and says now. The hand reaches into water and says yes. When evening comes in a valley that keeps green through a long winter, the air smells of stone and spruce, and a lamp's flame stands straight. Frost forms on grasses just beyond the pool of temperate air. Inside the pool, a moth still tries the circle of light. They sleep there with the comfort of particularity, not because the world is gentle, but because some corners of it are. In the morning, the pocket will exhale again, and they will eat berries that remember last year's sun, and the day will begin not with conquest, but with thanks. Fire speaks in verbs. It asks for breathe, for shelter, for feed. It answers with warm, with light, with transform. They learn the grammar by sitting close, night after night, leaning into the glow until the syntax of ember and ash writes itself into hands. An ember is a noun that moves. Tinder is a preface. Sparks are a tentative punctuation. Ellipses that may become a sentence if wind and patience agree. The lesson travels, carried pocket to pocket, season to season, hearth to hearth, like a language that refuses borders. Embers go on journeys. In dry, slow fungus tucked within a pouch, in a hollowed lump of punky wood, in a shell lined with charcoal dust, a coal rides under careful guard. It does not announce itself. It sleeps and then breathes when asked, a portable dawn. To carry yesterday into today reduces risk, and risk reduced becomes space for generosity. A party arriving cold receives a warm start. A watch set in wind has a hidden heart to awaken after midnight when the sky grows hard. Sometimes the ember is delivered like a gift at the edge of kinship. Fire exchanged along with food, news, and a small treaty of future help. They understand ignition as a spectrum rather than a moment. Pyrite kisses flint to release a brief meteor shower, which falls into a nest of shredded bark, or grass teased thin, or charred cloth saved from a garment too old to mend. A breath lengthens the orange's ambition. Later, a bow drill writes heat with pressure and rhythm, the spindle singing into the hearthboard until smoke lifts like a pale signature and a dark dust threads itself into a coal. Hands learn the song of the bow, steady, unhurried, the kind of rhythm that calms those listening as much as it persuades wood to change state. Winter asks for redundancy. Charcloth is not always available in early ages. Instead, the fungus amadou softens into, felt under long attention, and accepts sparks as if accepting small seeds. Birch bark curls like a ready page, its oils eager to speak flame even when damp. Resins gather into torches that whisper when carried, a breath-like crackle that does not disturb the night's larger quiet. Each technique feels local and personal, tuned to the dampness of a valley, the hardness of a particular wood, the stubbornness of a particular wind. The hearth, once lit, becomes a teacher of restraint. They bank coals under ash so the core sleeps without dying, peel a layer aside at dawn, tease a flame up without haste. Wood is selected as conversation partner, dense pieces for endurance, smaller sticks for responsiveness, certain branches for the pleasant, low-smoke burn that spares eyes and hides. Even the arrangement has a rhetoric. The tippy's eager climb, the log cabin's steadiness, the long fire's feed for many pots. Children learn to watch the language of edges and hollows, where blue says efficient and yellow says learning. Stone changes under attention. Heat persuades stubborn flint and chert to fracture more gracefully. Silkcrete anneals and grows cooperative, its inner bonds relaxed into a future of cleaner breaks. A slab warmed next to flame becomes an anvil that does not shock a blade into waste. Birch bark, given low oxygen in a covered hearth, weeps tar that cools into black, forgiving glue. Resin and charcoal and fiber knead into mastics that hold stone to wood with a grip both strong and elastic. The adhesives become a quiet triumph. Chemistry learned by listening and by failure. Sticky proof that curiosity is a survival trait. Landscape listens to fire and speaks back. In grasslands, cool burns in late season comb away old thatch so green can find light in spring. Along forest edge, patches are opened gently, persuading berries to grow in abundance, inviting ungulates to return and feed, and then return again. The burns are small, specific, experimental, more suggestion than decree. People learn that flame can be a scalpel rather than a scythe. Charcoal drifts into soils and darkens them into better hosts. When later storms arrive, they pass more lightly because fuel has been braided into ash. A valley remembers careful burning as a promise kept. The record of such care is subtle. Lakes hold thin black lines in their mud, each a pulse of fire filtered through years of rain. Cave ceilings carry soot in spaced, delicate crescents where lamps once wrote the arc of the arm that tended them. Hearths, repeated in the same sheltered place, stack shallow bowls reddened to permanence, ceramics without vessels. In open country, rings of stone migrate inward under many refirings, telling of winters layered like tree rings. The archive is practical, not performative, yet it still glows when the future brushes it with a fingertip. Across distances, the grammar standardizes and diverges. One valley favors bow drill, another the hand drill with a mouthful of water to moisten the spindle's dust just so. Some coals travel with the trading of blades, some are lit as ceremony, at the first berry. Some never leave a certain cave where a lamp has burned through a century in a sequence of small, careful nights. Yet, beneath variation, the basic clauses match. Feed small before you feed large. Shelter the leeward side. Share the heat with bodies, with stones, with water. Quench the wood before you quench the light. Fire alters time as much as temperature. Nights lengthen into usable hours. Tasks fold inward. Stitching, scraping, the slow arithmetic of dividing food. Thought lengthens too. Plans reach across seasons because the hours to make them exist. Memory prefers the lamp's pace. Stories find their cadence in the rise and fall of flames, sentences hooked on the shared attention a hearth secures. A world that might be only survival grows a layer of meaning, of reflection, of gentle experimentation, because a circle of light protects that space. It also changes appetite. Raw becomes cooked, and cooked becomes culture. Starches loosen, toxins retreat. Flavors thicken into comfort that feels larger than nutrition. The body spends less on digestion. The mind seems to receive that surplus as room. Children fed broth sleep easier. Elders warmed by tea speak longer. A hunter who eats hot fat regains hands quick enough to mend a line before sleep. Around heat, a species learns to pace its hungers so that tomorrow remains possible. Not all flames are welcome. Lightning can lay a black road through a stand of spruce. Drought can conspire with spark to write a fast grammar of loss. In such years, the lesson leans toward humility. Fire is not owned. It is hosted. Hosts learn. To clean and clear, to read weather, to unbuild a hearth when wind turns contrary, to stay alert for the sly ember that wanders. Children receive the rule without scolding. Sleep with water near. Honor ash. The landscape taught them. They answer with carefulness. Kinship thickens around coals. A guest invited to the edge of a hearth is already within the circle of trust. A gift of tinder from a far valley becomes an embassy of plant and place. Two groups part with a shared ember, and for days afterward, each tends not only its own fire but the other's shadow within it, a modest pact that fire makes visible. If there is a currency in cold lands, it is attention. If there is a bank, it is the glowing trench under ash at dawn, interest paid in heat. If everything vanished but a thin seam of carbon in a pond, would a mind in a later age read the verbs that shaped it? Perhaps. It might infer people standing. At the edge of night, palms forward, faces warm, turning wood into hour and hunger into company, carrying little dawns in pouches as they crossed a wind that forgets to be gentle. The grammar of fire would be there, quiet as always, asking for breath and returning stories, asking for shelter and returning a space where thought can uncoil without fear. The ember waits, red at its core, dark at its skin. A breath, a careful lay of grass, a patient hand that knows when to leave it alone, then the soft flare, then the steadying, then the atmosphere of possibility that spreads to fill a room, a valley, a winter. They listen, they feed, they share. In their custody, flame becomes less a danger survived than a companion understood, and in that understanding the cold age grows habitable. Hands appear where stone breathes cooler. In the hush between drip and echo, a palm settles, fingers spread like a small constellation, and breath becomes paint. Pigment drifts through a hollow reed, iron red, manganese black, charcoal soft as sleep, and the negative hand blooms, a soft absence rimmed by color. The gesture is simple and feels like a vow in a world that asks delicacy. A hand says, "We are here," and also, "We are together." They work with the earth's palette. Ochre crumbles into a tired sun of powder. Soot lifts from the lamp's edge like dusk you can hold. A gray-black mineral leaves its whispering streak even in weak light. Binders are familiar: spit, fat, plant gum, while brushes are fur tied to a twig, moss dabbed into a pad, or fingers that already know texture. The wall collaborates. Roughness catches, polish refuses, a vein of calcite brightens a line as if it shone from inside. Light is a co-artist. Lamps cup oil and feed a wick of twisted fiber. The flame steadies, and stone seems to move. Mineral skin catching gold and giving it back. Shadows herd bison over curves and let horses lean forward, into a run. Where the wall bulges, ribs arise from light alone. Where it retreats, a cave lion hides with two eyes and the implied arc of a muzzle. The chamber influences breath. Far inside, air cools, the lamp's smoke teaches the limits kindly but firmly. They linger where drafts trade and keep a slow exchange. You alive. In those places, sound behaves with intention. Footfalls multiply. A hum becomes chorus. A clap returns as hoofbeat. Some notice that animals gather on panels where echoes answer. Perhaps echo invites image, or the image invites the ear to hear echo. Hands cluster as if comfort prefers company. Small palms nestle among larger ones. A finger missing its top joint leaves a gentle gap. A child's reach climbs higher when lifted by older arms. Sizes make a quiet census. The wall does not archive names, it archives presence, young beside old, many beside. 1. Sometimes a palm turns inward and prints its own positive, a twin to the shadowed negatives that breathe around it. Signs accompany the palms, dots in constellations that may be counting, or music, or neither. Lines that climb ladders toward unreachable, ceilings, branching marks that could be plant, could be river, could be thought. The mind prefers patterns, and so does survival. If dots speak of moon and migration, the language remains gentle. If grids remember traps and chevrons recall antlers, each suggestion stays modest and useful. Materials travel with stories. A red, not native to the valley, arrives bright and strange, carried in a pouch that smells of a coast seen last summer. A black that refuses to wash from skin comes from a cliff 2 days inland. Pigment journeys weave kinship into color. A piece of hematite swapped for dried fish leaves a stroke that later ages will misread as local and thus miss the friendship inside the line. Even misreadings belong. They testify to continuity. Technique refines slowly. Blowpipes lengthen so breath softens before it meets the wall. Stencils acquire small ornaments at the wrist, the echo of garments that keep wind from skin. A hand becomes a template for a horse's muzzle, a bison's shoulder, a bird's wing folded in sleep. The makers do not call themselves artists. They are tailors of attention. Their reward is the way a room changes after pigment dries, how it feels. Warmer without more heat. Outside, the hunt continues. The shelters stand, the rivers hum. Inside, the wall gathers a different kind of food. It feeds memory, the one resource that grows by sharing. A child sleeps easier under a ceiling that holds a sky of hands. An elder tells of the winter when smoke lay low and you had to crawl, like a fox to breathe. The wall answers with its own gesture. In this dialogue, loneliness loses its argument. Pigment's chemistry has its own tenderness. Iron gives red as tiny grains of rust. Manganese gifts black that swallows light. Calcium permits white. Ground fine. Powders slip into pores and marry the rock, later wearing a veil of calcite that softens hues but prolongs them. Time edits but does not erase. Chemistry keeps the drawing company. Speculation walks gently here. Do the hands mark? Agreements. This cave ours for a season, this spring kept clean by everyone. Do they mark passages? That one now old enough to enter, this one returned from a far hunt, that one mourned and remembered. Perhaps they are simply delight, the way a child cannot resist wet mud and a flat rock. Perhaps they are teaching. The hand stops where the cave breathes badly. The hand continues where air is good. A few figures step beyond the scene. Lines wrap a human shape until it becomes more like wind or thought. Dots hover where eyes would be. The cave allows low-lit metaphysics to draw the sense of a presence rather than a body, to leave space for unnameable pressures that move through a winter mind. Masks appear without faces to carry them, footprints without feet to own them. The effect is not terror but balance. Not every wall receives mark. Some rooms hold only lamp soot and the scent of old warmth. The choice to leave rock untouched may be respect or a lesson about moisture, or simply a different mood. Variability matters. It means the tradition breathes rather than repeats. The hand that paints today knows how not to paint tomorrow, trusting. That meaning does not rely on quantity. Centuries accumulate. A calcite curtain grows down like a translucent root and hides a deer that once leapt. Water finds new paths and glosses corners into mirrors where a torch's heart doubles. The cave edits, and the hand endures, sometimes bright, sometimes faint as the memory of an old camp, yet still legible. A species practicing presence, tenderly, in the earth's deep rooms during a season when tenderness seems unlikely. They emerge at last into night, ears listening for the river's slow voice. Behind them, hands continue to glow in the dark that keeps its own counsel. Outside, snow begins, slow, the same white dust that once bound pigment to wall when breath carried color to stone. A palm warms in a mitten touches another mitten. The human world stays near its lamp. In the morning, they will pass the entrance and see fresh tracks curling along the drift, as if the night had placed its own hand upon the snow. Above the frost, a deeper rhythm moves, too slow for pulse, too patient for weather. Stars appear to hold their places while, beneath them, the planet inclines and nods, adjusts the way it leans toward light, and glides through space on a path that is almost a circle and never quite. Ice hears this metronome before anyone else does. Snow lines creep forward or retreat as the sky's arithmetic shifts by degrees that seem trivial to an afternoon and decisive to an age. Humanity survives within these breaths of the orbit, finding a life between tilts and wobbles and the gentle eccentricities of a world that never repeats itself exactly. Tilt becomes season. The planet keeps its axis bent as if favoring a shoulder, and because of that, light and dark trade places through the year. The angle is not fixed. It sways across millennia, just a couple of degrees, yet that small motion recalibrates the contrast between summer and winter, especially near the poles where sunlight is already an exercise in scarcity and abundance. When the tilt grows larger, summers at high latitudes burn a little longer and hotter. Ice softens and forgets to last. When the tilt relaxes, summer loses some edge. Snow finds reasons to remain. A bright skin persists into autumn and seeds more brightness. Survival adjusts with it. Roots shift a valley over, refuges lengthen or shorten their generous seasons. Berries ripen under a schedule that belongs less to the day and more to the eon. Wobble arrives like a top settling. The axis itself slowly rotates, tracing a circle in the sky. This precession does not change how much light the planet receives in a year. It changes when each hemisphere receives it most intensely. The timing of closeness to the sun slides against the calendar of solstice and equinox, and summers line up differently with the planet's slight nearness or slight distance. The effect is modest in measure and grand in consequence. Monsoons breathe more fully when land warms hard under a summer that leans into nearness. Deserts remember rivers and grass when rains travel deeper inland. On another swing of the wobble, those same lands tighten into silence. People ride these alternations without knowing their source, reading them instead on the ground. A lake deepens. Hippo prints mark a muddy bay. Later, dust writes long letters across the horizon, and the lake retreats into salt. Shape matters as much as posture. The orbit stretches and relaxes over long cycles, from nearly circular to slightly oval and back again. The difference is delicate. The consequences are compounding. When the path lengthens into ellipse, the contrast between near and far grows, and the wobble's timing gains leverage. Summers that occur when the planet is far lose some appetite. Winters that occur when it is near surrender some severity. The same cycle, in a different alignment, reverses the emphasis. Ice pays attention. So do rivers. So do those who follow. Both. No one in these winters speaks of numbers for tilt or years for wobble. They speak of what the sky and ground agree on. A star that once rose over a certain notch now lifts a little to the side. A dune's march changes tempo. A valley that used to green for 2 moons now greens for 3, and a trail of water shines a little farther west before it sinks. Knowledge accumulates as place lore, not formula, but the lore keeps faith with the cosmic schedule, an apprenticeship to patience. Far under the feet of time, archives grow pages. In ocean mud, tiny shells record the ratio of heavy to light oxygen, a diary of ice worldwide written in the chemistry of those who once drifted freely near the surface. In polar ice, air sleeps in bubbles that whisper of breath, carbon, methane, rising and falling as cold and warmth tug at each other. In caves, dripstone thickens in damp pulses, a mineral metronome that remembers rain or its absence. The patterns converge. Light modulated by tilt and wobble and orbital stretch, Earth answering with snowline and storm track and dust, life answering with movement and chance. Why should summer at high latitudes carry so much weight? Because ice does not simply melt or freeze. It remembers. A cold summer can fail to erase the previous winter's accumulation. Snow survives to be buried, the surface brightens, the air above cools more, and a feedback loops. A warm summer can overtake what winter wrote. Dark ground drinks light, warmth compounds. The difference between a melt season that finishes its work and one that leaves a remnant becomes the difference between a small, polite glacier and a continent wearing armor. People plan around the edge of that decision, tracking what survives on the north slope in late sun, noticing which valleys keep old snow long enough to suggest a new habit for the herd. The sky's slow instructions do not act alone. Volcanoes. Spell punctuation, years of shade, thin harvests, then subside. The ocean decides to store or release heat and answers the orbit in its own layered dialect. Plants participate. When green thickens, the air shifts. When green retreats, dust travels and changes how much light the planet returns to space. Fire edits fuel and writes charcoal lines into lakes. Ice speaks longest, but everything speaks. For those living through a single winter or a clutch of them, the clock is invisible and still operative. A corridor opens across a dry plain that once was sea floor, and hoofed lives pour through. People follow and learn a new coast that will not last. Far away, where sand now leads the eye to a hard horizon, A sapling trends upward into a tree that can host a platform, and children who are not yet born will climb it and look out over a lake their parents did not know. Elsewhere, a land bridge widens between cold seas and then narrows and drowns. Its memory becomes a fishing ground. The slow clock permits, then withdraws, then permits again. Survival practices moving when the hinge swings, lingering when it settles. The scale of the cycles encourages a certain humility. No skill can insist that a lake remain when the wobble turns deserts inward again. No right can hold a coastline steady when ice drinks rivers and lays them down far from any tide. And still, human choice matters. To travel light and share heavy. To attend to the way wind tastes as a front approaches. To notice when berries. Skip a year and spare the bushes. To let a valley rest and return to it with less appetite. These become the instruments a small species plays within a symphony conducted by angles and ellipses. If a person looks up on a clean night, the stars seem faithful, but their grid drifts almost imperceptibly as the axis writes its circle. Stories adjust to keep them near. A hunter's belt keeps pointing toward winter dawns, but names shift a little over centuries. Navigation inherits the correction as if it were a new verse. No one says precession, someone says the stars used to rise there when my grandmother was young. Children hear the sentence as a suggestion that time has room. There is comfort in the idea that meaning does not require control. The slow clock does not ask for agreement. It sets the conditions under. Which agreements make sense? A grazing route can succeed for generations because, for that stretch, tilt and wobble conspire toward gentler summers and rain that visits on schedule. Then the route thins, not because of failure, but because the baseline has turned. Flexibility becomes an ethic rather than a tactic. What saves a group is not a map that claims permanence but a style of attention that never hardens. To live under cycles this long is to practice faith in continuities too large to name, and in details small, enough to touch. A hand on a stone warmed by noon. A reed that glows green in early frost. A drift whose curve forecasts the night's wind. Above, the axis nods, the orbit leans, the ellipse lengthens and relaxes. Below, water finds a new path around pebbles, and returns to itself. Between these scales, people sleep and wake and decide, again, to share and to move and to wait and to try. The slow clock keeps time without sound, yet everything plays to it. The glaciers scrape, the rivers gloss, the grass that lies down in winter and rises in spring, the lamps that make small suns under rock. The question that lingers is not whether the sky governs the ground. It is how a thinking animal learns to listen to governance that never speaks aloud. Perhaps by reading the ice for what it remembers. Perhaps by trusting that patience can be a form of warmth. Perhaps by letting the stars change their places. A little and calling that change a story. Snow resets the world each dawn. Tracks lifted in moonlight vanish under a hush of new powder, and the path that seemed sure becomes a field of forgetfulness. In such a world, the night sky becomes a grammar that does not erase so easily. They walk by it, think with it, and let it move inside their breath. Stars are winter companions. Not masters, not machines, but steady presences that lend direction when the ground is undecided. They learn the sky as a place, not a picture. The Milky Way arches like a slow river frozen only in appearance, its dim brightness gathering from countless small fires too far to name. At certain seasons, the river leans northeast to southwest like a slanted road. At others, it stands more, upright, pointing nearer to the pole. They do not say coordinates. They say the Sky River lies across the sleeping mammoth tonight, and a traveler can hold that angle in the mind the way one holds a lyric. The horizon turns beneath that arch with deliberation, and by noting where the river meets a particular, notch of ridge or the seam between two hills. They keep a memory of direction that the morning's wind cannot blow away. A keeper star seems to hold the night still, but it is not the same keeper across all ages. Sometimes the pole is marked by a modest light, not grand, that serves anyway because it is patient, circling only a little. In other millennia, another star comes closer to the axis and takes on the role of near stillness. The change is too slow for a life to notice sharply. Stories adjust the way a coat is mended, quietly, stitch by stitch, so that pointing north remains an act of recognition rather than of calculation. Children are shown the small circle stars make about the sky's hinge. They watch the circle for a season and then for a year and feel inside the slow comfort of recurrence. Rising and setting become bookmarks. A cluster lifts from the east at the same place along the line of hills in the same week each cold year. A bright wanderer returns, not perfectly on schedule but near enough to count on as a companion. Heliacal risings, when a star appears again, at dawn after a season lost in the sun's glare, offer a whisper of calendar. The first morning a certain shape clears the low light just before day. They say the salmon will thicken the river within moons, or the berries will blush in the warm pockets by the rocks. Not because the stars cause these returns, but because both answer the same, deeper metronome. Sky and ground hum to the same key, and the ear learns to hear harmony where causation would be a ruse. The moon is a lantern that keeps its own counsel. Waxing, it builds a walkway across ice. Waning, it hands the sky back to the smaller fires. In deep cold, moonlight composes a blue world where edges sharpen and shadows lengthen like ink that refuses to dry. They time journeys to that light, trusting that snow under a near full moon is a map that does not need a drawn line. They also know the moon can betray the eyes. Glare thickens on certain nights, and a narrow slit in a mask saves sight for tomorrow. Halos ring the moon when high ice clouds arrive. The ring's clarity tells of weather marching from far horizons. A double halo, rare, faint, draws a shared breath around the fire and a small, reverent silence, not for omen, but for wonder. Aurora writes on the polar roof in sentences that do not translate into roads yet still feel like company. Green veils drift and fold along lines the eye slowly learns to recognize as the sky's own architecture. A red glow sometimes stains the darkness like distant coals. They do not follow the lights. They look at them the way one looks at the ocean, aware that it is larger than hunger or root, a phenomenon that widens the mind enough to receive a night's cold with a steadier heart. Afterward, when the lamps are tended and breath plumes the air, talk eases and sleep arrives as if invited by the memory of the sky moving. On a ridge where wind files the surface down to glass, they measure star heights with their hands. A horizon, to a bright point, 3 fingers, perhaps 4. Not a number that binds, but a feel that repeats. If a certain bright star at dusk stands 2 hands above the western edge of a pass, the valley beyond will be reached before midnight. If the winter cluster tilts this much at moonrise, the river bend lies another hour north. The hand remembers the sky with more precision than the tongue can store, and the wrist, held steady by a habit of patience, becomes a quiet instrument. Sound partners with starlight. On clear nights, cold makes air dense and honest. A waterfall, miles away, puts a pale thread into the silence. Wolves weave their chorus into a map of distance and intention. Snow speaks underfoot with different consonants, dry crystals squeaking below the freezing of breath, damp grains sighing when a thaw has passed this way. The ear processes these into direction, while the eye confirms with the heavens. When the ground removes ink each morning, the senses conspire to write the page again by dusk. Markers on earth invite the sky to participate. A line of standing stones, small, practical, cites a particular notch where the sun will hesitate at solstice before beginning its long return. A forked branch set near a campsite frames a cluster's rising where trees otherwise block the view. At a river crossing, a carved notch on a trunk indicates the star that should stand above the far bank when passage is safe and the ice bears weight. These are not monuments so much as reminders, soft devices that let the body rejoin a larger rhythm without argument. Memory stores the sky as music. A sequence of names, or not names exactly, but notes, the hunter, the fish, the bird whose wings never quite move, arranges along a sung path. Each verse correlates with a bend of the trail or a safe spring. If the verse is forgotten, the ground might still correct. If the ground is disguised by wind, the verse steps in. In lands where maps would freeze and split, songs remain pliant, fold into pockets, and unfold again under starlight without losing their shape. Those who keep watch train their night vision the way others train their hands. They sit at the fires, edge and look beyond the glow, letting rods in the eye take the lead, letting color drain into silver where details gain sharpness. Averted gaze becomes habit, not looking straight at a faint star but beside it, letting it emerge on its own terms. This small discipline converts darkness into information, and information into gentle confidence, the kind that does not swagger but knows when to turn, when to wait, when to speak softly into the wind and move. Sometimes the sky refuses to cooperate. Cloud closes the dome, snow drives, horizons vanish. Then the compass is kinship. They travel in a rope of voices, each taking a turn to cut trail, each calling the small reassurances that knit group to group. They attend the wind's grain along cheeks and the drifts feathering at their feet, trusting that the storm will end and the heaven book open again. When it does, they recover not by triumph, but by resuming the conversation, matching their small lives to stars that have no need of them, and, paradoxically, serve them best by that indifference. There is a humility in using the sky. One cannot bend it nearer. One can only learn its mood and practice being a good listener. Yet listening to something so enduring gives the heart a shape that matches winter. A person who walks by starlight learns to think in long arcs and to accept small corrections. A group that sleeps under aurora learns to expect beauty without demanding reason. These lessons, multiplied across dark seasons, gather into a people who survive not just by strength, but by attention, not just by hunger, but by wonder. Snow will keep erasing. Stars will keep refusing to be erased. Between them, paths emerge, that only exist while being walked, then vanish, then exist again. They step forward anyway, breath sinking to the pace of constellations, feet writing a temporary poem on a page that blows clean at dawn, hands measuring and songs remembering, the sky their quiet companion, the night their usable room. Hunger moves with them like weather, felt more than seen, shaping hours into choices, choices into customs. Memory walks beside it, a softer companion that remembers where last winter's bones lay weathering, where tracks tend to bend toward an easy ford, where the wind piles snow into barriers a herd will skirt. In the long cold, megafauna write their bodies into the land, mammoth with its walking hills of fat and fiber, bison dark as storm fragments, horses that breathe steam into dawn, reindeer that read lichens under snow, great elk that lift forests of antler into the air. People live at the edge of these presences, attentive, modest, hungry, grateful. They learn to watch before they think to reach. A herd's mood shows in tail and ear and the tightness of its circle when wind prowls. Mammoth matriarchs keep calves inside and arrange themselves as weather. Bison face outward with lowered heads and become a ripple of intent. Horses align with the storm to spare their lungs. Snow records rehearsals, a drifting of prints that suddenly tighten into a sprint, a churned patch over a spring where warmth thins the crust, a long, straight groove where heavy shoulder met a slope and slid. Reading this is not merely finding food. It is learning the grammar of other lives. Hunting, when it comes, moves at the pace of season and patience. Spears balance in hands that have spent evenings coaxing shafts straight over steam. Stone points, thin, bright, more suggestion than wedge, ride grooves carved in wood and settle with bindings that shrink into trust. Some carry spear throwers, small levers that lengthen an arm and lend the point a swifter voice. Nets of twisted fiber stretch across a notch where the land narrows. Snow walls lean just enough to nudge a course. Brush fences, humble and incomplete, invite a choice. The drive is less chase than persuasion. They do not require many. The land cannot spare many. They learn restraint like a song that improves. When sung softly, a strike that lands is both physics and prayer. The animal stumbles. The circle closes without triumph, only necessity organized into competence. A second thrust follows to shorten fear. Then the world slows. Hands touch warm flank. Breath thanks breath. The lamp of the body dims with a dignity attended by those who will eat. They speak without speeches, a palm to hide, a quiet truing. Of the head so that eyes do not face a sky. Grief participates. Gratitude becomes a method. The ceremony is not an extra. It is a way to make memory carry weight so that appetite does not grow careless. Work follows, clean and thorough. Cuts respect. Grain. Hide releases in broad swaths. Fat is set aside while still warm. A gleam thick as comfort. Marrow answers stone's persuasion with a soft giving. Shins become vessels for broth. Tendons relax into long threads that later will be sinew. Stomachs that once held winter grass become bags. Bones with song in them become flutes. Bones with leverage in them become handles. Ribs arch into the architecture of windbreaks. Nothing leaves without teaching a future use. Even the skull, heavy with thought that used to be, returns with a precise seriousness to where water will carry it through seasons and remind the valley what fed it. Preservation is the science of tomorrow. Cold keeps much, but not everything, and not always. Thin, wind-bent air dries strips of meat into a tenderness that refuses rot. Smoke writes a veil of chemistry that discourages other hungers. Meltwater pits lined with ice become larders. Frozen banks hollow into caches sealed with stone and marked by a language of cairns that only the group reads. Sometimes the land offers extreme cold, a cliff shadow that never thaws. Sometimes it offers only cool and dry, and knowledge adjusts. Cut thinner, hang higher, render fat sooner, mix meat with berries and tallow into a portable dusk of calories. Hunger respects foresight. Foresight respects restraint. Memory catalogs animals as teachers as much as meals. Mammoth prefer a pasture that renews after burn. People answer by burning small and cool in late season, asking grass to return tender and abundant. Reindeer see with noses and their hooves, make a crisp music. Drives for them consider wind first, obstacle second. Horses run to the horizon if chased wrong, but fold into pockets of terrain if invited by a temporary wall and a careful silence. Bison spook at angles. Approach becomes geometry. Great elk vanish as if antlers were sails catching intentional wind. People learn the value of stillness proportionate to those sails. The record of this compact with megafauna spreads across sediments in quiet signals. Scatters of stone in valet-like arrangements where butchery stood, piles of broken long bones where marrow mattered, chips of pigment where hides were smoked under color and care, a slumping ring of bones where a shelter weathered decades into the dust. In peat, pollen pulses show grass thickening after fire. In ice, bubbles of air remember that herds once covered valleys and breathed out a chemistry that now sleeps. The evidence is not a shout. It is a steady murmur of coexistence with predation acknowledged and bounded. Restraint evolves into a rule that feels older than rule. Take the slowed, the fallen, the old. Do not interrupt the future of a herd in a single winter of appetite. Share meat outward to kin lines that will return the gesture next season when your valley's weather turns unhelpful. Cache openly within the group, and hide sparsely from predators that also depend on this season's bodies. Accept that scavengers clean what weather cannot. Keep a piece uncut for those who were not here. Elders unable to walk the drive, children sleeping through snow. These are not laws because there is no enforcement beyond consequences. They are practices because tomorrow is always watching. Companionship with large animals changes the human body and mind. Tracking stretches stride, lengthens attention, steadies pulse. Eyes learn to focus both near and far, a double vision that sees rib hair lift in a gust and, at the same time, the slope a mile away where the herd's momentum will falter. Hands grow even-fingered and calm. Stories lengthen into instructive. Tapestries, where the mammoth line broke one year because a storm cupped the valley and confused their ears, where the bison calves' timing coincided with a sudden flush of grasses on the lee of a burn, where a horse with a coat like storm. Foam kept returning to a salt lick at dusk, teaching a pattern that fed many quietly for 2 winters. Some animals depart, slowly, finally. Ice withdraws, marshes spread, forests thicken, and bodies built for open country find their rooms shrinking. Or people change, innovate, hunt too well or too often, or sickness walks invisibly among hooves, or droughts stack and fold like thin pages with too few words for comfort. The archive of absence is hard to read without sharpening it into blame. Those who live through change do less arguing and more adjusting. They turn toward smaller game, more fish, bulbs tucked deep in ground, seeds saved by grinding and patience. But even in adjustment, a memory stays. The felt pressure of a mammoth's foot through the soil, the communal shadow of bison under a white sky, the moral presence that a large, generous body exerts on a small, clever one. Beauty enters here, in a way that surprises. A flute from wing bone changes night. A pendant from polished ivory catches lamplight. A figure carved from mammoth tooth suggests a form the world does not strictly need and yet hungers to see. Ornament is not waste. It is an ecosystem of mood, a reservoir that fills on good days to spill into bad. When a figure stands at the edge of a hearth, something in hunger relaxes its grip enough to let generosity keep its schedule. In winters, deep, a child licks tallow from fingers and listens as an elder names animals not as possessions but as neighbors with tendencies. The lesson is calm. We live because we learned their habits and accepted the shape of their lives. We live because we thanked them, and when we forgot to thank, we learned quickly that forgetting is cold. In the morning, a line of dark backs will move against the pale far slope, and choices will present themselves. They will take what they need, use what they take, share what they use, and leave the valley walkable for those who will follow both them and the animals they follow. Fog draws a gray room around the world, and the ocean speaks through walls. They stand at the edge of ice-season water, listening for land that cannot be seen, listening to swell rebound from a shore that must be there, to birds commuting along unseen lines, to the deeper hush that long waves keep when they run out of fetch, and begin to fold. Courage here is not loud. It is an ear held open and a patience that waits for the fog to grant a single, generous window. Between great sheets of ice a country rises where a strait will later divide. Steppe broadens, stitched with sedges and dwarf willow, with heaths that cling and aromatic herbs that sign their presence across distances in low sun. This is Beringia, a long, pale bridge that is less a plank than a continent, green-brown under a sky that tastes of salt and north. Winds cross without obstruction and polish the grasses into a nap that shows direction. Herds browse, then flow, then stand as weather. People move where the herds suggest and where the sea keeps offering its complicated abundance at the rim. The horizon here is both invitation and test. On clear days, a mountain spine stains the far sky faintly. On most days, fog leans in from cold currents and writes a soft boundary, intimate and unhelpful. They learn the signatures inside the gray, the smell of kelp that means a rocky shore, the sweeter, marsh-laced scent that means a river mouth, the ammonia of a nesting cliff that means steep approaches and eggs in season, the broad, sea-deep, breath that whales leave behind when they sound. Sound navigates. Surf thickens in pitch near sand, thins where the bottom drops abruptly. The slap against a hidden reef carries a regularity like a drum teaching a dance. Boats become extensions of the second skin. Frames of driftwood and bone, what the sea delivers from continents, tie together with sinew and root. Skins stretch taut and shine. Seams think like fish, shedding. A boat holds a lamp, a whisper of home afloat. The lamp burns tallow and keeps the damp from settling in bones. They wear coats that are almost weatherless, stitched from translucent gut that refuses rain and accepts breath. Paddles test the surface, reading chop that moves one way and swell that moves another, sketching a vector the eye cannot see. Far offshore, a porpoise rises where a line of darker water begins, and the paddles turn toward that threshold because edges feed. Migration does not proceed like a march. It pulses. Groups move, then rest, then winter, then learn an inlet the way one learns a person. Children memorize the way a certain cloud sits on a certain knob when the tide is low. They learn. The pattern of foam that means an outlet cuts through the beach. In one cove, kelp gardens offer a pantry too generous to abandon. In another, storms shatter confidence and suggest a pause inland. The route becomes a chain of rooms, each named by the body's memory more than by speech. The horseshoe bay with the two old spruces, the long bar that vanishes under new moon, the dark ledge where muscles shine like punctuation. Sometimes feet replace paddles. Ice grips the coast and roughens it into programs of traction and risk. Leads open and close in. A language learned daily. They walk with poles and light loads, scouting for the dull gray sheen that betrays thinness, feeling for the low drumbeat that says the flow is shifting. Seals watch, blinking, heads commas on a long white sentence. At Polinyas, life billows. Birds plan their summers in midwinter. Bears knows the margin. Humans harvest and bless because this open water owes no one consistency and yet keeps giving. Land is not the only crossing. They walk the big bridge too, where the strait will later run, across valleys that now sleep under tides. Step feels hollow sometimes, light over permafrost, the ground's drum-answering footfall with a tone that later centuries will not hear. Rivers braid like bright hair let loose, oxbow lakes hold mirrors to low sky. Camps bloom where willow winds break, and where a sandy ridge keeps wind from stealing sleep. Microblades, small, exact, flake from cores and set into slots in bone. And antler, turning light weapons into resilient ones. The toolkit indicates mobility and care. Gear meant to be carried far, mended often, relied on without drama. Fog thins some mornings and shows a chain of punctuation marks. Volcanic islands, where Earth lifts its hot shoulders, throws steam, seeds clouds. The arc suggests a path. A line of rest stops set in rough water, each with its own microclimate, each a teacher in a different subject. Currents here, birds there, driftwood arriving in useful sizes on this beach, fish cooperating more fully. In those channels. They do not conquer the chain. They court it. When weather scowls, they shelter. When it softens, they move. Underfoot, pumice crackles. Under hull, kelp writes a soft resistance that is warning and welcome at once. A story passed along the route says that land sometimes shows itself without being seen. Clouds pile in odd ways over islands and capes, their bottoms trimmed by the wind off stone. Light bends around hidden coasts and throws a mirage. Looming, headlands that come and go like slow breath. Swell, that patient, far-born thing, refracts around obstacles and tells the attentive boat where the hard world interrupts the soft. These are not tricks. They are instruments, and those who live by them treat them as one treats music, listening, repeating, teaching, leaving room. Evidence of these crossings does not accumulate loudly. Water later overlays much of what was camp and trail and lullaby. Yet hints remain like stars seen out of the corner of the eye. A tooth of a deer that belongs to a different climate turns up along a river on a day when frost lets the bank crumble. A beach yields a point made from stone, far from this shore, hitchhiking in a pouch with grease and dried fish, dropped during a repair, then buried by centuries of tide syllables. A cave mouth watches over a spit where people once learned the timing of tides so precisely that they could walk the sand 2/3 of a day and return before the ocean reasserted its rule. In lakes ringed by tundra, cores of mud hold the ancient pollen of grasses and sage and the tiny cases of beetles that prefer a cooler air, memory braided in sediment so thin the eye would mistake it for sameness. Some say there is a long pause. On the bridge, a quiet eddy in time. The land refuses to be only a passage. It becomes a home seasoned by winds from two oceans. Populations settle into its particularity, its dry cold and its lamp-bright winters, and gather strength, techniques, patience. Then the hinge opens. Whether by the coast's kelp-fed continuity, or the interior's thawing corridors, or by both in polite alternation, the journey resumes. The speed is not uniform. It is measured in generations, in marriages that carry place names as dowry, in songs that acquire new verses noting a certain cove's milder spring, a certain river's stubborn ice. Fog breeds tenderness. One must trust without proof until proof arrives as the shape of a bay under the day's first shy light. Trust rests not on certainty but on accumulation, of signs, of swells, of birdways, of the taste of the wind when it slips around a headland. Courage, then, is not a leap. It is a continuity of small acceptances and adjustments. A paddle stroke turned a degree. A camp placed 6 feet higher. A cache disguised with rocks that look unarranged. A child lifted so that their eyes can memorize. The meeting of two clouds that always means the channel will calm by dusk. Sea levels wake and climb again, tidying the route under a blue archive. The bridge narrows and goes under. Islands become more islanded. Bays learn to be fjords. The memory of the crossing stays not as a single tale but as a distribution of customs that make sense in new rooms. A certain way to sew a seam, sew a boat. Will shrug off chop. A way to read the daily muscle of the tide in the bellies of fish. A habit of caching lamps where driftwood always arrives tangled after storms. Kin meet kin after long arcs and discover that their words for fog and patience resemble each other, the vowels softened by the same weather. On a morning that will not be written, fog parts for a handful of breaths and shows a shore as near as a song, black rocks strewn as if a big hand set them down one by one, a river braiding out into a fan across pale sand. Birds revolve in loose gyres above it. Seals ink themselves along a ledge. The smell of a generous low tide walks on the air. Paddles pause in a shared stillness. Then they move, quiet, not to conquer a continent but to enter another room in. A long house of sky and water, carrying embers, needles, songs, the patience of crossings, and the soft, practical courage that listens for land long before it sees it. A path can be carried in the throat. Before lines scratch rock or ink scratches hide, a melody travels, and with it the body remembers how to move through a landscape that keeps revising its white page. The song rises when the wind turns. slows when the ice sighs, adds a beat where a ridge demands a shorter step. Memory wears cadence like a warm coat and finds, again, the places where water waits under crust, where a pass opens, where a valley keeps its quieter air. Songs begin as topography shaped into breath. Each phrase fits the distance between landmarks. A hummed line for the flat, then a brief leap to mark a boulder shaped like a sleeping seal, then a long-held tone for the stretch where snow drifts deep and ankles sink. The voice paces the legs. A refrain reminds the group to angle right of the stunted willow that leans as if listening east. Another refrain marks the exact count of steps between two safe patches on river ice when thaw makes edges treacherous. In this way, melody functions as measure. The brain holds the map inside rhythm, and feet can retrieve it without any need to see the ground. Ice has its own music, and the song incorporates it. Where pressure ridges lift blue teeth and the surface looks like an ocean paused mid-break, the tune breaks too, short notes, quick breaths, so that bodies match their care. Over black ice so clean the stars look back, the melody smooths into a level line that invites gliding. At Polinyas, where open water steams, a warning tone descends and then rises, like the breath caught in the chest and released again after. The test. Children learn the motive early, humming danger without fear because warning is built into comfort, and comfort travels with warning like two hands in one mitten. Words anchor the music to the land without pinning it. A verse names a hollow where wind settles, yet the name is less a label than a mood. Soft Snow Bowl, Bluestone Lip, Breath Valley. Another verse remembers a spring whose rim greens before anything else. The tune pauses there just long enough to taste the sweetness in the mind. If the spring shifts, as springs sometimes do, the melody shifts too, and the new note sits beside the old like a cairn added to a cairn, a record of the landscape's revision and the people's acceptance. Hands join the mapping. Palm beats against drumskin count inclines and descents, 2 quick for climb, 1 slow for level. 3 scattered as a reminder to watch for sastrugi aligned to a harsh wind. The sound carries across white distance when visibility forgets to help. A group hums the same shape, and their strides synchronize enough to share effort without wasting it. Breath becomes communal, a metronome against which fatigue learns to pace itself. In the long middle of a march, the song keeps the heart from hurrying into hunger. Some songs are winter only. They belong to the season when the ground is quiet, and the air remembers stars better than dust. These travel routes that would be rivers in other months. They describe how the channel bends under snow, which will appear as a faint hollow and a different squeak, where a tree snag lifts a paragraph, of frost that marks a narrow. When spring returns the flow to its visible bed, the winter song sleeps, and another wakes. A summer path along terraces, a set of notes for berries that come first on south faces, then under aspen, then in wind-shadowed gullies where the soil holds nights cool longer and sweetness thickens. Songlines recruit the sky without deferring to it. A verse attaches to a star's rising where it crosses the notch between 2 hills. The pitch bends as the star climbs, an audible slope for a visual climb. The Milky Way's diffuse road has a chord of its own, and when it lies across the route, the chord hums longer, an index to orientation that complements the feel of wind and the taste of the air. If cloud covers everything, the song remembers anyway. It stores the angle of passage as pattern, and those who have walked it can sing the turn even as snow erases the world to arm's length. A map, sung in company, is a continual error correction. One voice wavers when a ridge has slumped since last year. Another adds a note that signals the change, and the chorus absorbs it. No single throat holds all authority. The reliability arises from overlap and from the etiquette of listening, the shared willingness to let the landscape adjudicate when the song and the snow disagree. When the group rests, the music quiets into the steady hush of breath, and the mind continues to walk the route, polishing it even in stillness. Sometimes the land itself sings back. Basalt rings when struck. Thin ice peels when tapped with a pole. A taut gut line over a hole in the cover drips a slow water music as fish breathe below. These incidental notes become cues. A passage with 3 stone bells at ankle height teaches a 3-note motif. A cliff where ravens argue writes their calls into the chorus. Over time, such motifs become part of place, as recognizable as the curve of a shoreline. Even when the ravens are away, their remembered phrases guide feet along the safe shelf where, their nests once hung, bone flutes carry roots into night. A low sequence can imply distance, the number of breaths between camp and spring, the inhalations required to reach the notch with safer footing. The flute's timbre, breathy and close to the body, supports the way memory prefers to lodge in, feeling rather than in arithmetic. When a child falls asleep to that sequence, the root climbs into dreams and stays, so that years later the body will turn without hurry at the correct cairn, confident without knowing why. Oral maps never freeze. They absorb new water and return it as song. A flood takes a favorite ford, and a verse mourns without scolding and names another crossing half a day upstream, adding a note that tastes like effort and relief. A winter of lean driftwood inspires a line that guides toward a bank where the river's loudness predicts better caches. When elders leave, their voices remain woven into these updates, timbres remembered on certain notes, a human ley line running forward without requiring the speaker to be present. In storm, when speech would be stolen by wind, the body remembers the choreography of the line. Steps become a script learned long before. High, then short to avoid the weak cornice, wait low, then glide, then stop for listening. Some roots are danced into the legs the way a prayer is knitted into the fingers. In this, the song remains even in silence. The spine holds the refrain. The shoulders carry the cadence. The feet execute the memory's gentle orders. Many traditions around the world will later speak of pathways held in narrative and tuned to land. It does not require a single origin to be true. Human minds are equipped with rooms where place and sequence share a wall. A melody taps that wall lightly, and the door opens. A path appears not because a map exists, but because the body knows that music implies motion and motion implies return. The Ice Age simply emphasizes the usefulness of this architecture. When ink would crack, when paper would light too easily, at the hearth, when stone stands too far from the day's range, the voice continues, durable and weightless. In the pocket valleys where warmth keeps a small garden alive through cold years, songs settle as well. They carry recipes and stitches, the serial order of tasks that make a shelter breathe properly and a fire burn clean. Music here does not only traverse, it sustains. The lullaby for a restless child includes the names of nearby herbs, a mnemonic that aligns care with place so thoroughly that one cannot be thought without the other. In this way, the repertory of roots and the repertory of tending become a single archive. Night lowers. A group moves along a ridge that remembers old wind. The melody chosen for this section sits low in the voice, a tone that warms the chest, and makes breathing slow. Far below, a river writes its silver line toward a sea that will not appear until morning. Above, faint curtains of light lean and fold. The song takes them in without asking what they mean, the way a path takes in a curve without needing to name it. Footfalls keep rhythm. The route unfolds exactly as long as the singing lasts, and when it ends, they are where the melody promised. A hollow out of the wind, willow enough for a lamp, ice thick enough to trust, the stars arranged like a staff, waiting for the next notation. They study what is missing and call it knowledge. Wind has eaten most of the story. Water has rearranged the rest. Fire has left its thin, black handwriting and gone on. The Ice Age archives in partial sentences, And archaeology answers by learning to read ellipses. Stone endures because stone is stubborn. String, wood, basket, laughter, milk, and gossip dissolve, and so the record tilts toward edges and chips and hearth. Even so, the silences speak if the listener leans close and lets quiet do part of the work. A scatter of flakes sits in pale grass as if a bird had molted stone. The big piece shows the angle of the blow, the tiny ones glitter like frost. No one sees the hand that struck them, but refitting makes a brief return. A puzzle solved in reverse until two edges kiss after millennia apart. In that kiss, a gesture reappears. The body that made it remains unsummoned. The archaeology of absence keeps choosing the gentle truth that not everything can be called back. Bones are choosy archivists. Thick shafts endure. Slender phalanges grow porous in wet freeze-thaw. Collagen leaves on its own schedule. In caves, bone keeps longer, sleeping under dripstone ribs. On plains, it leans into dust and joins it. 1 year's camp erodes into a slope that becomes next century's floodplain and then a river's bright. Side cut? A site is less a point than a tide that rewrites its shoreline. Those who sift such shores learn tides of wind as well as water, deflation that leaves only the heavy eloquent, dunes that move a campsite intact and lay it down elsewhere. Like a careful porter, perishables vanish into a long yes. Needles and awls remain when luck and dryness conspire. The garments they mended travel onward into soil the way breath travels into night. Nets leave weights. Baskets leave the pattern of their weave only where fire baked their silhouettes into. Clay by accident. A child's toy of grass, a sling carefully braided, the soft strap that kept a knife from being lost. All exit the archive with a small bow. Yet their ghosts persist in wear polish on stone, in the ligatures of bone, in the geometry of what remains, a perforation where cord once ran, a seam line etched by hide pulled taut, a notch polished by a missing loop. Hearths hold the most modest. Courage. They redden sand and alter minerals. They caramelize soil. They fix a layer of carbon that a future can weigh. The archaeologist of absence does not ask for a spectacle. A lens of charcoal that thins to nothing at the edges becomes a night cupped in two hands. In lakes beyond the dune, a black filament threads the mud. A year when the valley's careful burning left a signature in sediment. Farther down, the filament repeats. Not empire, not disaster, just maintenance, patience, a syllabus of small fires. Some evidence arrives as afterthought. Teeth remember the day by their chemistry. The water drunk, the season of birth and weaning, then travel through time enclosed in enamel like a sealed room. Hair in ice keeps the shape of a diet. Fingernails hold a tiny calendar of stress. Even dirt keeps confidences. A smear of soil from a cave floor contains the drifted DNA of bodies that once rested there, ghost letters in a script learned only lately. Warmth dissolves such letters, cold holds them longer, yet both speak if asked softly enough, and the answers come as probabilities rather than faces. Dates breathe with the world's breath. The clock that counts carbon exhalations works, then falters, then smooths again as trees and oceans take turns with the air. A year can spread into a century on that curve. A century can tighten into a year. Those who work with this clock accept. It's tied and build their patience into models that gather many weak lights into one gentle glow. The effect is less certainty than texture. A sense of when a valley hosted people every few winters, when a lake's shore served as a summer edge, when a corridor opened in ice and then closed, its hinges audible in charcoal and shell. Absence widens beyond material. Labor leaves fingerprints that do not touch stone. The hours of scraping hides, of washing fibers, of carrying water from springs, of babysitting a hearth's shallow breathing. These works polish bones and chords and world views. They rarely polish rock. The camps that the record loves, kill sites, quarries, the places where a tool broke, imply their companions by imbalance. Where meat is chopped, someone later warmed, broth. Where points are made, someone later mended a mitten. The archaeology of absence learns to read these implied rooms, to place a lamp on a floor that is no longer there and imagine footprints converging. Not to decorate the story, but to keep it honest. Silence is not only poverty of finds, it is also deliberate. There are places where marks are not left because survival prefers erasure. Springs kept clean without monuments. Berry patches ungarnished by cairns so bears keep their confidence. A root sung rather than traced keeps its privacy without malice. When later the land gives nothing back but quiet weather and ordinary stones, that quiet can be the artifact, proof that restraint functioned as a tool. Ice itself edits as it writes. Freeze heaves lift artifacts and then lay them down again a palm's width away. Solifluction smears seasons into ribbons. Permafrost holds, then sighs, then releases and lets an entire corner of a camp cascade like slow water. The record becomes palimpsest. A flake of flint from one winter nests against a char from a fire set decades later. The mind wants to marry them. The discipline says, leave them unmarried unless the fit is true. This refusal is a form of respect, a way to let time keep its complexity. There are rooms where absence is almost complete. Continental shelves that were grass now sleep under tides. The richest early kitchens of fish and kelp and shell lie out. Beyond surf, their hearths turn to sand waves and their posts to reefs where anemones open at noon. The present coastline offers late chapters, and the story feels inlanded by necessity. Divers find a drowned forest and bring up a leaf that breaks in air like parchment. Trawls lift a point that was a gesture when the sea floor was a meadow. The mind draws a dashed line from these to a vanished village and recognizes that a dashed line is still a line. Some archives keep too much, and sorting becomes its own humility. Caves stored tens of thousands of years layered in inches. A footstep makes a confusion if the floor is not hardened by calcite. An animal drags bones further in. A drip prints circles that the eye mistakes for intention. The archaeologist enters these rooms like a listener joins a long conversation, attentive, quiet, reluctant to claim understanding when the voices overlap. A single strand of fiber in a protected crack can outweigh a sack of chips in open dust. A smudge of pigment behind a rock can reframe a wall. Absence instructs the gaze to stay soft and the hand to move less. Then there is the silence of meanings. Why a certain pattern of dots? Why a hand without a finger? Why a figure whose belly is emphasized and whose head is not? The temptation to answer runs strong. The discipline of night says, ask better questions. Perhaps the dots count. Perhaps they count nothing and simply steady the mind, the way a mantra does, the way weaving steadies grief. Perhaps the missing finger is an injury. Perhaps it is an idiom. The archaeology of absence practices alternatives without choosing among them loudly, leaving room for people to have been as complicated as anyone, anywhere, anytime. In the end, what survives of a wintering species is asymmetrical. Stone points keen as frost, hearths dim as memory, bones thick and thin, smudges of red where breath once carried color, shells in places where the sea no longer comes. The rest is carried forward in those who descended. Habits of generosity, ways of stitching warmth, techniques for listening to wind. Evidence that lives in behavior rather than in ground. A dig can touch the ground. It cannot excavate a lullaby. Yet, when the trowel pauses, the hush it reaches is sometimes the very thing it came to know. The way absence holds shape like a snow mold, a negative that implies a positive, a quiet that contains, if not answers, then the outline of enough. Night stands over the plain with its usual charity. The wind erases prints, and somewhere a stone flake waits face up for light that may never come. That waiting becomes part of the archive, too. Not everything becomes legible. Not everything needs to. A species learns to live with a record that whispers, and in listening to that whisper, it hears itself practicing care across a gap, a kindness toward what is missing, and by that kindness, an understanding. A question glows like an ember banked under ash. If a thinking species rises and falls in deep time, what do the rocks remember? The thought moves softly, like a hand feeling along a cave wall in low light. It does not insist that such a species exists before them. It wonders what earth keeps when minds depart, how stone hosts memory, how silence curates. Rock is a slow librarian. It files by grain, by chemistry, by pressure, by patience. It keeps shorelines as sand turned to stone, storms as crossbeds, rivers as scrolls of pebbles sorted by size. It preserves bones when luck colludes with mud, teeth more often than ribs, shells more often than flesh. It saves pollen in lake-dark laminae, charcoal in thin black threads, ash in pale pages. If minds have ever made a fever in the air, the rock may not name the fever, but it may hold the echo as altered ratios, as a chemistry that swerves for a while and then returns. A civilization, if it blooms, speaks a mineral dialect. It digs, it fuses, it scatters. Cities become quarries reversed, stone pulled upward into walls and then returned by gravity and time. Concrete, a man-made limestone, cures into a familiar mineral grammar. Steel becomes oxides and finds its way back to Earth's rust. Copper leaves halos in soil where it concentrates beyond ordinary chance. If the bloom is brief compared to mountain building, glaciers, seas, these artifacts are less monuments than drifts. Erosion edits them, but the editing itself can be a signature. Unnatural concentrations of elements pooled in deltas, an alloy's odd ratios stratified in a floodplain's patient archive. Some traces try to outlast forgetting. Polymers, stitched, long and stubborn, learn to fray. They fragment into grains that travel with silt, sift into bays, sink in anoxic basins where oxygen seldom visits. There, deprived of the usual appetite of rot, fragments might rest longer, becoming a strange future sand laced through clay, a technosediment that later pressure could turn to a rock with an unusual gleam and a chemistry that puzzles the handheld. Scan of a far descendant. Beach fire fuses plastic to basalt and makes a stone that would not exist without heat and intention. Wave and sun wear it. To a geologist of ages hence, a small oddity in a beach rock section, a point of pause rather than a proof. Other signals, not objects but patterns, ripple wider. Burn the long-stored light of ancient plants, and the sky takes note in its quiet bookkeeping. The ratio between carbon's heavier and lighter selves shifts, just a little, just enough to leave a negative whisper in reefs and lake muds, a thin line that says, for a time, the planet breathed faster, and warmth followed. The sea answers. With a shade more acid, and some shells grow thinner and then different, and that, too, is a line. Oxygen retreats from certain waters. Black shales accumulate where fish once wrote silver. Tiny spheres of fly ash drift into peat and become a peppering of glass spherules that are not volcanic and yet are ash. Each is ambiguous alone. Together they begin to hum. A thinking age rearranges nitrogen, too. Lightning and bacteria already. Fix it into forms food can use. Industry would widen that gateway, letting fertility walk where it did not, encouraging algal feasts that end in emptying waters. In the archive of mud, this exuberance leaves layers rich in phosphorus, poor in oxygen-loving creatures, rich in those who prefer low oxygen and calm. The pattern, like all patterns, could come from many causes. river capture, climate tilt, soot, and drought, but the bundle is suggestive. A human season, if it happens, teaches lakes and seas to keep a slightly different diary for a while. There are sharper signals, the kinds that age normally erases and that, precisely for that reason, stand out. A brief rain of artificial radionuclides is as close to a timestamp as geology allows. Its half-lives tick down like patient metronomes until they slide under detectability. Clay might hold the ghost of their decay even when their names are gone. Other synthetics, chlorinated, fluorinated, like to persist. Their halogen hands grip tightly. Heat, pressure, and time will caution them. Some will let go. Some, perhaps, will yield to new chemistry and enter minerals as impurities that later eyes could read as notes from a vanished laboratory. Fossils respond, more slowly, in biography rather than in test tube clarity. A civilization loves company and spreads species around like gifts and accidents. Seeds ride ships. Rats ride grain. Mollusks ride hulls. Weeds learn new continents and thrive on edges. The archive registers this as sudden, wide appearances and odd pairings. Pollen from one lineage crossing oceans without ice's help. Shells of a harbor creature showing up in an inland lake. Extinctions would refuse to be precise in time, but might cluster at a horizon where other signals cluster. Isotopes, soot, metals, spherules, altered clay. The pattern would not shout. It would repeat a gentle, unsettling chord. Stone compresses centuries into millimeters. 1,000 years can narrow to a fingertip in a limestone ledge. If a civilization ebbs within a few tens of millennia, much of its rhythm would be averaged away, like waves smoothed into a tide on a chart. What remains are the anomalies that reach across basins, the habits that persist long enough to enter the global room. A single city is mortal. A style of chemistry is harder to kill. They consider old warmths, the carbon upset that streaks a page 56 million years down, the fever with its own patient name. In that event, the line wavers negative for a few tens of millennia. The seas grow warm. Some creatures shuffle geography. Some go. Soils breathe more. Methane may hurry up from slumber. Black shales collect in places. Was it all natural stirrings? The Earth's internal arithmetic? A pulse of stored carbon released from long sleep? Almost surely. And yet the pattern tempts thought. If minds had stirred then, too, would the rock look much different? The answer stays misted, perhaps a little. Metals gathered oddly, polymers fossilized as whispers, clays holding manufactured geometries. But not a proclamation, not a statue. The thought experiment does not aim to prove, it calibrates humility. It suggests that even now, with lamps and needles and neat ideas, their own presence may one day reduce to a chord, carbon lightened, nitrogen loosened, shells thinned, metals pooled, spherules sprinkled, and that chord may rhyme with chords. From other eras that owed their music to volcanoes, to thawed clathrates, to fires of forests rather than factories. Evidence would be a braid, and teasing out the human strand would require patience and a willingness to hold more than one story, in the same hand without squeezing either into silence. Such thinking returns to winter like a tide returning to a bay. They sit by a hearth and let the mind pace across ages. The Silurian hypothesis, named playfully after old fiction, serious in its method, asks not whether the past held cities under ferns, but whether geology can notice a civilization without, knowing its language. Rocks answer in their way. Yes, but faintly. Yes, if the season is long enough and wide enough. Yes, if one looks for bundles rather than single clues. Yes, if one accepts that deep time edits without malice. What comfort arises from this? Perhaps this. Survival in ice is already a conversation with traces, tracks erased by morning, paths held in song, warmth sequestered in habits rather than in monuments. If the future knows this time by a chord rather than by a chronicle, that would not be so strange. The rocks will remember generosity imperfectly. They will misplace lullabies. They will keep ash with unusual metals and remark, without language, that for a while the air leaned a different way. A species that sleeps under aurora and walks by star learns to accept that kind of memory, the kind that keeps shape without details. Snow ticks against the hide at the door. The lamp hums. The thought dims to a gentle coal. Stone keeps counsel, not secrets. If minds arose before and went, the planet filed them as it files glaciers and forests and great fish into layers that refuse certainty and invite attention. They breathe, let the question remain a question, and match their patience to the librarian's, content to be part of a record that is quiet and sufficient. Far away, a mountain empties itself into the sky. The column climbs until it becomes its own weather, a gray tree with lightning in its veins, then spreads and thins into a sheet that begins to fall across half the world like a thought too large to hold. Ash drifts, and for a while the sun forgets its appetite. Noon turns the color of weak tea. Shadows lose their edge. The air carries a dull taste of stone. They live through this as they live through most things, by paying attention, by sharing, by moving when moving seems wiser than staying. The eruption's scale defies ordinary scale. It is not a cone clearing its throat. It is a caldera rewriting a map. Molten stores escape, pumice rains, glass needles ride the wind, sulfur joins the high cold and stitches a veil that alters light. The veil does not argue. It simply exists, scattering brightness back toward space, asking plants to proceed with less, asking the planet to lean temporarily toward cool. The questions unfold with the ash. Does winter sharpen past its usual edge, and if so, for how long and where? Do harvests falter, herds shift, rains change the rooms they visit? Or does the world, larger than the plume, absorb the shock with regional grief and global patience? Stone remembers the event as an index. Tephra lays down a horizon that later hands can touch. A thin, pale line in lake mud, in ocean cores, in cave drips that falter when ash darkens the forest and water hesitates. Grains under a lens carry the mountain's signature, shards with particular angles, chemistry like an accent. Ice, far away, receives a dusting and a faint change in the snow's trapped breath, more sulfur perhaps, gagged sunshine, inked in bubbles. Yet, even where the record keeps its receipts, it does not translate directly into human stories. It shows a sky altered. It does not decide whether a valley empties or endures. They endure by living locally. Where ash falls thick, streams silt, and fish withdraw. Eyes sting. Roofs learn weight. Where ash falls thin, soil later grows oddly generous. Minerals feed plants that feed animals that feed people who remember the gray season with complex gratitude. On some coasts, the sea remains bountiful even as the land coughs. Seaweed ignores the sky and listens only to water. Shellfish close and then open. Kelp forests continue their slow, fish-rich sway. Inland, springs continue to hum through porous stone, muffling the sky's change and offering a continuity that a camp can grip. A winter made from a mountain's breath is still a winter. Laminas of scarcity separated by bands of ordinary. The mind imagines a bottleneck, the word itself narrow and glassy, as if a river of lives must squeeze through a single constraint, and emerge fewer, chastened, perhaps genetically thinned. It is a compelling shape, a vast eruption, a dimmed sun, a species in the balance. Perhaps in some regions numbers indeed shrink, mouths count more carefully, babies wait for better seasons. Yet the earth resists simple reductions. Other regions see continuity, tools made in familiar forms above and below the ash line, middens thick before and after, signs of presence unbroken. The story may be a braid, contraction here, resilience there, mobility linking the two like a discrete bridge. Evidence speaks softly and not always in unison. In one basin, layers hold fewer hearths for a while. In another, hearths thicken as if a corridor drew travelers seeking kinder light. A cave's dripstone pauses, then resumes, with a different chemistry, hinting that rain retuned its pattern. A grassland watches herds recalibrate routes to avoid ash-crusted forage, then sees calves arrive after a lean year when predators made their own adjustments. Children born under a dimmer sky grow into adults who know the taste of stone on the tongue and the feel of snow that seems to fall from two directions at once, down from cloud and sideways from rumor, and they carry that memory into careful habits. Ash as material joins the toolkit. Fine, it polishes hides with a new efficiency. Mixed into mastics, it changes the feeling under a thumb, slightly grittier, slightly stronger. Pumice becomes an abrasive. Where obsidian travels with the eruption's geology, edges gleam that were harder to acquire before. Thus, disruption seeds improvements, and improvements travel as quiet reparations for the days when light kept its distance. The mountain takes and gives, unevenly distributed, the way gifts often are. Season by season, groups test thresholds. In heavy fall zones, they read ash like snow. Drifts reveal wind. Crusts reveal melt. Footprints keep for longer and then vanish under another gray hush. Food prefers washing. Lungs prefer rest. Old people teach how to keep lamps burning clean in thick air. They move camps upslope, where breezes scrim the valley's heaviness, or into basalt corridors where weather cannot reach as easily. They learn. A new cautiousness with water. Ash steals clarity, masks depth, hides ice. Poles sound the stream bed. Children learn to hear the different song of a brook running turbid and faster under load. Animals answer the sky in their own idioms. Some graze ash-blunted grasses and sicken. Others paw to lichens that ignore what falls from above and depend on what rises from rock. Salmon return with their usual patience. Their shining bodies carry seas untroubled by a distant volcano, and this continuity becomes a pillar. Birds shift nesting for a year or two to cliffs unburdened by ash. Then they return, as if reminded that home is a pattern more than a place. Predators follow the motions of prey. People follow the motions of both. The dance does not stop, though. The music changes tempo. The idea of bottlenecks reappears as genetics enters the archive, a latter-day technique that reads the living as if they were a sediment of inheritance. Some signals suggest that, long ago, numbers were low for a time. Other signals leave room for explanation by movement and distance, by serial founding of small groups along long routes rather than by a single narrow pass imposed by a winter of ash. The humility learned from hearths and caves applies. When records conflict, hold them both where possible. When conjecture tempts, let it walk, but do not let it run. A mountain's story is easy to aggrandize. A valley's story is usually modest and true. Across generations, the eruption's pulse dissipates into weather again. The sun brightens. Ash weathers to soil. Lakes clear. The line it left in sediments remains a fine bookmark, a memory with an index that field hands can point to. Here the world thinned its light. Here our ancestors' lamps did more work. Nothing conclusive rises from that finger jab but a texture, an awareness that the planet sometimes speaks in sudden syllables and that survival prefers continuities, networks, redundancies, and small persistent hopes. Rites absorb the memory, without dramatizing it. A pinch of ash brushed on a newborn's brow could be blessing or simple practicality against insects. A flute carved from bone collected near a long-cooled pumice bank carries a tone that seems to hold a faint rasp of the stone. Stories mention a season when noon dimmed and birds flew oddly. They do not universalize. The group across the range remembers differently or not at all, because their refuge saw little fall and their main trial that decade was wind, not ash. The lesson the mountain offers is not doom, but scale. A species that already knows winter learns that other kinds of winter exist, some with crystals, some with glass, some with absences of light. It deepens the ethics already in place. Share widely, cash modestly but often, diversify appetite, keep roots open, keep songs flexible, honor springs and coasts that ignore the sky's tantrums, read the behavior of animals before trusting the look of plants. In practicing these, they pass through a season of ash as they pass through other seasons, changed, alert, unbroken. Night lifts slowly after such years, and when it does, stars look sharper as if scrubbed. The lamp resumes its ordinary monarchy. Children born into clearer air ask about the gray stories and find them plausible but distant, the way a grandparent's winter seems both near and unrepeatable. On a quiet slope, grass grows through a thin blanket of pale grains that the rain sorts and the wind moves. A footprint presses the ash into soil and merges both into the same dark. The mountain sleeps. The people do not forget, but they do what they have always done. They step, they breathe, they share, and they keep listening for the next long syllable the earth might choose to say. At dusk, breath becomes more than breath. Someone lifts a tube of bone to the mouth, and the evening learns. Another color. A tone slides out, thin, silver, close as a whisper, and the air around the fire answers with a hush that is neither command nor surrender. Beauty arrives wearing practicality's coat, unnecessary in the way a horizon is unnecessary, essential in the way horizons teach direction. The melody is small. The effect is large. Shoulders loosen. A child's hands unclench. A watcher at the door keeps watching, but the watch grows kinder. The instrument begins long before sound. A hollow bone. Birds, because wing bones are already light and hollowed by flight. Sometimes mammoth ivory split and planed, then carved into halves and glued with pitch and fiber back into a cylinder. Waits, while a maker studies it by touch and by ear. Holes are coaxed rather than forced. A flake drills a patient circle, twisting, listening for thinness. Spacing is guessed by thumb width and then corrected by sound. A plug of resin might adjust. The mouth. A shim of bark might correct a hole that asked for less. There is pleasure in the tolerances, close enough to sing, far enough from perfect that the player remains necessary. Breath finds the column of air and sets it trembling. Physics, wearing warmth, does its work. The length decides the note. The holes open windows where pressure drops and rises. The harmonic series offers options as if saying, climb if you like. Even without names, fingers learn intervals that feel like steady ground. A few steps sound safer to most ears. Somewhere between half and whole the hand settles on pattern. Scales do not arrive as theory. They arrive as what feels kind in the chest and intelligible to a group seated in lamplight. The player tests, repeats, abandons, returns, and the instrument ripens into something conversational. Music makes a room before it makes a meaning. The flame seems to lean in. Shadows gather, as audience. The day's labor keeps breathing through arms and ribs, but the breath now moves with different purpose. In that shared timing, bodies slip into coincidence. Hearts edging toward common rate, lungs sinking in a quiet democracy. Groupness thickens without plan. A song requires listening and timing and restraint. These are survival skills already, exercised now for pleasure and for nothing measurable, and by that paradox they strengthen. It is not only at the fire that notes are useful. On long walks, a phrase repeated every few dozen steps keeps cadence smooth and wastefulness at bay. At a river crossing, a two-note call answers another from the far bank and narrows the moment of doubt. In fog, a tone holds steady and returns from a cliff with a delay that advertises the cliff's distance. Yet the instrument is not a horn for warning. It leans toward gentler assignments. It carries lullabies that fold fear's edges back into sleep. It fills the white of a storm with small architecture so that time does not dissolve into formlessness. A winter with songs has more corners. Animals answer, not as audience but as participants in the same air. Reindeer lift their heads and stand, still when a certain pitch threads the willow. Ravens tilt and offer back a rough commentary as if teasing a fellow musician. Seals watch with eyes that reflect two small lamps. The music does not promise luck. It does not call the herd nearer. But it trains attention and patience, the qualities that make luck legible when it arrives. It teaches the body to wait into the end of a phrase before moving, to feel the tension that resolves, to recognize patterns becoming patterns again. Sometimes the melody enters the stone. A cave mouth holds reverberation the way a bowl holds water. A note blooms, swells a heartbeat, later on the wall, and invites a second note to lean into that bloom. Players learn rooms as much as they learn instruments. In one chamber, a low tone carries. In another, a thin, high strand draws lights onto the ceiling where hands once breathed pigment. The room becomes part of the ensemble and writes its signature into the music. A specific swell, a specific decay. A listener cannot say how the song will travel. They simply feel the place singing back. Archaeology, visiting centuries later with soft brushes and steadier light, finds evidence delicate enough to make the breath go quiet. A wing bone, pierced with holes that match the reach of fingers, edges chamfered by use, a mouth notched thoughtfully, a seam along ivory where pitch once glued halves whole, a drop of adhesive fossilized in a thumbprint. Even the wear around holes speaks, this finger more than that, this player favoring a certain sequence. Music leaves almost nothing, and almost nothing is enough to say. Someone here chose sound when silence would have sufficed, and in that choice, winter gave back an inch. Beauty behaves like cash. It stores surplus from good times in forms that can be retrieved when the day is poorer. A season of abundant fish grows instruments and songs. The songs then soften lean months. They cannot be eaten, they feed anyway. They keep anger from becoming law. They buy a few quiet minutes for a tired parent. They turn a group of individuals into a breathing set. When the lamp burns low and the storm insists, a tune's few notes can feel like opening a pantry to find a jar left for just such a night. Rhythm enters feet. Snow packed by dance becomes a floor that does not swallow energy. Joints warm. Circulation accelerates in kindly ways. The sequence of steps, repeated, becomes memory's scaffold. Stories tie themselves to that scaffold and return more easily. Children learn kinship through verses attached to names, through refrains attached to places. The line between mapping and music narrows. A melody marks a spring. A counter-melody marks the safer shelf above it. The brain uses beat to file the world and the body to retrieve it. Grief attends the music as honored guest. When someone leaves, a phrase holds their name as contour, rising where their laugh rose, resting where their step always hesitated before the door. The group plays it without speech. Tears arrive or do not. The point is not to empty sorrow but to keep it articulated. In this way, beauty keeps feelings from hardening into edges that cut the group. The flute does not fix hunger. It keeps room for gentleness sufficient to share the last of the dried berries without calculation. Science lives quietly inside all this. Entrainment is a word no one says while hands tap the same pulse. It is still occurring. hearts learning each other's pace. Oxytocin is not invoked when a lullaby works. The chemistry participates anyway. A hormone as old as mammals threading through lull and breath and the cuffing touch that keeps a baby close to heat. Overtones travel farther than fundamentals on cold nights. A player angles the instrument and finds the ghosts of higher notes gliding over the dark like pale birds, reaching the watcher on the ridge with a message that needs no translation. Here, with us, now. The instrument itself becomes a person in the kind sense. Its voice grows familiar, a timbre that the group could pick from many in the fog. It breaks one spring, and the sadness feels larger than an object deserves. It is repaired with pitch and patience and returns with a slightly new vowel. That. Change writes into songs, and the songs lengthen to accommodate the newcomer. Continuity arrives not as sameness, but as tending. A flute's scars are as welcome as a shelter's mended seam. When the day is fully done, music does not conclude. It relaxes. The last notes do not fall to silence so much as hand silence back the room it always owned. The player lowers the tube and rubs a thumb across a hole as if smoothing a child's hair. Breath goes back to being only breath. The small audience resumes tasks that are not exactly tasks anymore. Threading a needle, turning a stick in the coals, checking the seam of the door against snow, and each feels accompanied by something without weight. Is it necessary? The question answers itself by surviving. Beauty gives a species a margin, strength saved by better sleep, anger dissolved before it wastes energy, courage calibrated to reality instead of to panic. It also gives a glimpse of a world that includes usefulness and exceeds it, an economy that counts warmth and wonder together without forcing one to justify the other. In the cold age, this is not ornament. It is a way for bodies and hearts to continue in proportion to the landscape's size. Night finishes arranging itself. The lamp's halo makes a circle like the mouth of the instrument. Outside, snow continues, its quiet arithmetic. Inside, a bone flute rests on a shelf of antler, a small cylinder of saved breath, ready to return usefulness to beauty, and beauty to usefulness whenever someone's hands remember the positions and someone's lungs remember the pace at which gentle things begin. Kinship behaves like a tool that cannot be dropped. In the long winter, bodies make heat and hands make things, but it is relationships that make tomorrow arrive. A group, small enough to move and large enough to share, invents ways to balance hunger and hope, distributing both as if they were resources. Generosity becomes a technology, not decoration, not saintly exception, but equipment as essential as a needle, as tested as a spear. Food moves along invisible paths. A successful day returns not to one belly, but to many. The distribution redraws the group's map as surely as a river chooses its course. Portions travel outward toward age, toward illness, toward those who watched the fires and kept children safe, while others walked the white distance. Some of the food travels beyond camp, carried to a neighboring fire that did the same the last lean week, because risk is not even and winter is a patchwork. This slow, mutual carrying substitutes for granaries. It is a granary built of trust. Debts register without numbers. Memory keeps the ledger as story and as pride, and the interest is paid in another season, another place, when the hinge turns and the roles reverse. Care also moves. Infants lean against many chests. Arms that do not make milk make warmth and steadiness and sleep. Elders who have given birth teach those who do. Those who never will still know how to swaddle, how to carry, how to read the color of a baby's breath when the air turns sharp. A child becomes everyone's project, and this shared weight frees each adult to hunt, to mend, to watch weather, to grow inward. The group becomes a breathing organism that survives because no single body is asked to do what a network does better. An older woman who no longer bears children becomes a storehouse of roots and recipes and alarms. Her attention lengthens childhoods and shortens hungry spells. A man hurt by ice finds that healing is a shared craft. Splints set under many hands. Broth arrives unasked. A place by the fire opens as if it had always been waiting for him. Grief arrives with the same steadiness as snow, and it, too, teaches survival. When someone goes, the group makes time behave differently for a while. Work slows but does not stop. Voices soften as if sound itself were heavy. Tasks gather into ritual not to conjure the dead back but to keep the living from falling. Apart at the edges where winter can enter. Objects change their meanings for a span. The knife set aside, the seat left open, and then return to ordinary duty, but differently, carrying a thin layer of remembrance. This choreography is efficient without coldness. It converts pain into cohesion. It prevents the scatter that kills more surely than weather. Names circulate, sometimes withheld for a season, sometimes given to a newborn like a small flame passed along a wick, and in that passing, a promise is kept. Your absence becomes our bond. Rules evolve, not as laws shouted, but as habits that feel like comfort. Guests at the edge of a camp are fed before questions involve details. A traveler whose lamp has failed receives a coal as if it were a coin minted by the group. Quarrels, when they appear, are cooled by tasks before they are cooled by speech. Walk. With me to the spring, help me raise this frame. And by the time the task is done, the edge has dulled and a solution chooses itself. Fairness gains a style. The strongest carry far, the quietest watch late, the nimblest break trail, the oldest advise when to stop. Authority rotates like a lamp tending from hand to hand. It is not a crown, it is a responsibility picked up and set down in rhythm with need. Kinship stretches beyond blood through agreements that are as binding as bone. Marriages move between bands and stitch valleys together into a fabric that shares news and manners and seeds. A shell bead from a far coast, a red that belongs to no nearby cliff, a style of stitch new to this river, these serve as receipts for long friendships. Fictive kinship, the naming of another as sister, brother, parent, expands the circle, until strangers arriving in a storm have a place ready-made within it. Ties radiate along watersheds and overpasses, linking refugia into a suprapersonal body that endures shocks through redundancy. If one valley leans into hunger, another leans out to balance it. Stories enforce and soften at the same time. Parables about the selfish hunter end in hunger. Tales of the generous ant end in grandchildren surviving a narrow freeze. No listener thinks the world follows stories. Every listener learns the world can be guided a degree or two by how people act together. Gossip, a low hum near lamplight, functions as a thermostat, discouraging hoarding without punishment, encouraging decent behavior without spectacle. Praise circulates more efficiently than blame when resources depend on morale as much as on muscle. A joke at the right moment can be a structural beam. Objects carry kinship, too. A needle case carved with familiar marks fits easily into another's hand. A knot is tied the way one family ties it and recognized across snow as a signature that says safe to approach. Small emblems travel as passports. A bead pattern that implies a particular river. A fringe that points to a certain cave. These signals are not banners. They are small conveniences in a landscape where hesitation costs heat. I know you, says the pattern. I know your teacher. Your stories and mine have met already. Hospitality follows weather rather than calendar. In storms, rules tighten into grace. A door opens to the next walker without discussion. The best place by the fire is given to the most endangered body. Fat is shared fastest because fat is warmth concentrated, and warmth buys time for thought. In benign stretches, rules relax toward play. Mock hunts, dances that arrange the group into shapes that mirror kin diagrams without drawing them. Games that practice throwing, balance, breath control, laughter. Children learn ethics in these rehearsals, not as commandments but as pleasures that keep the group alive. Memory does not live only inside heads. It lives in routes that the group can recall by song, in caches marked by a stone leaned just so, in smudges of pigment that mean water here in late summer, in rituals that cause certain moments to be repeated with attention. A midwinter visit. To a spring that always flows becomes a holiday without fixed date. A first fish right becomes a way to limit appetite long enough to guarantee the run's return. Restraint is celebrated as abundance held in trust. That celebration tastes like berries saved and shared in frost. It sounds like a chorus at dusk about where to set the next nets. Even conflict is harnessed. Competition tilts toward skill admired rather than resource seized. A throwing contest keeps sharpness keen. A story contest keeps humor precise. A long walk keeps silence practiced. Envy, when it lifts its head, is softened by rotation. Today, your design for the drive, tomorrow hers. Pride, when it swells, is redirected. Teach the child how you did it. Teaching converts prestige into safety. Net. The vanity that might fragment a camp becomes a tradition that stitches it. Language itself behaves like a tool for winter. Words for kinship multiply to track obligation with nuance. A word for the mother of a mother distinct from the mother of a father. A word for the one who took you in after your own were lost. A word for the child of the sister whose milk you drank. A different word for the child of the brother who shares your fire. Naming complexity reduces friction, makes generosity precise, keeps grief in a form that can be held and shared without overflowing. When the cold tests attention, clarity saves calories. They stand under a low sun and look like a small cluster of moving dots on white. Yet inside the cluster, a web glows, warm and tensile. It is made of taboos and permissions, of recipes and lullabies, of who hands the lamp to whom at midnight, and who knows the story of the southern pass when a Chinook surprises the valley. In another age, tools show in museums as points, awls, needles. The larger tool, the arrangement of people, into a system that converts scarcity into sufficiency, resists display, and persists anyway as a style of living. Kinship is that style. Portable, adaptable, tolerant of revision, rigorous where it must be. When night comes, they feed an elder first and a child next, and a visitor with the same spoon, as if it mattered more than meat whose bowl it is. In the morning, they tie cords at the waist of those who will go far, not only to hold mittens but to hold the line of belonging in case fog turns the world inward. Hunger waits at the border of the lamp's circle. Grief sleeps near the door. Both are invited guests with assigned seats. The house allows them in and does not let them take over. In this choreography, in generosity tended like fire, in grief tended like garden, a species winters through. The world loosens. Edges soften. The great white canvases that once laid themselves across continents begin to lift like careful curtains, and water re-enters the grammar of the land with more verbs. Drip, seep, braid, spread, reflect. A thaw is both event and temperament. It arrives in pulses, centuries of easing punctuated by brief returns to steel. Yet, taken together, it behaves like a mood shifting toward openness. People carry winter within them even as spring lengthens. The thaw outside invites a thaw inside, a recalibration of hunger and hope, of what shelter means when the wind steps back and forests begin to write in green. Ice draws down from the hills, exposing bones of country that no one now living has seen. Valleys uncurl their long toes. Lakes spread in the footprints of vanished lobes. Rivers that once ran braided and pale concentrate into clearer channels that sparkle like new thought. On coastlines, the sea returns to shelves it had abandoned. For ages, slowly at first, then more quickly, then pause, then surge again as ice dams fail and open passages. Islands wake, estuaries climb into river mouths, marshes discover the joy of mixing. People walk with the waters, rising with them, finding higher flats, discovering that the old camp where a lamp once stood now hosts fish that move in and out with the gentlest lift of the moon. Land itself rehearses a breath. Freed from weight, the crust springs upward, not by day or year but by lifetimes. Post-glacial rebound, a quiet insistence that Earth remembers pressure and its release. Shorelines tilt. A beach used for generations grows inland. Another, elsewhere, drowns and reappears only as a darker band over which waves write daily devotions. The map becomes provisional in new ways. Those who love steadiness learn a new steadiness. Flexibility. Caches are multiplied. Paths receive alternate verses. Shelters learn to take down and go up with less friction, because the good sites change their addresses even when stone stands still. Forests advance like a patient army of softness. First, the pioneers, willow, birch, aspen, opportunists of light and disturbed ground, then spruce and pine, then wider-leafed trees where climate allows. Shade redistributes generosity. Berries. In the understory, mushrooms after rain, small animals that love edges. The open steppe retreats, and with it some of the great bodies built for long sightlines. In their place arrive deer that prefer cover, wild boar that turn soil into gardens by accident, birds that braid the air between trunks. The hunt changes. Scale and style. Attention retools its lens from horizon to thicket, from the choreography of herds to the patience of waiting at a game trail that feels less like path and more like habit. Water invites new kinds of making. Nets grow finer. Fish traps become architecture. Wattled fences that angle current toward baskets. Weirs set like sentences that the river learns to read. Boats answer with forms suited to quiet water as much as to swell. Dugouts where the right trees stand. Frames and skins where they do not. On certain shores, clay shifts its career from hearth lining and repair to vessel. A pot holds water without letting it run, holds grain that is beginning to live in caches as more than emergency, holds broth that tastes deeper when simmered, slow against stone. If winter taught how to carry warmth, thaw teaches how to carry time. The diet edits itself with the land. Wetlands yield tubers. Forests offer seeds that can be ground into meals the river will carry farther without spoiling, and with that, calories gain portability in new ways. Berries preserve as paste, fish dry glossy and amber. Wild grains are persuaded into patches that look suspiciously like gardens even if the word is not yet spoken. Dogs, already companions in cold, become partners in new tasks within green. Tracking in leaf sound, carrying small loads, warning as sightlines shorten. Other species join slowly, cautiously. Some hover at the edges and later accept a closer pact. Domestication is not an invention day. It is a long, mutual tutoring of appetite and temperament. Memory refuses to melt. Winter persists as ethics even, as the world grows easier in places. Sharing remains a technology. Generosity continues to buffer weather's humor and the surprises of water. Kinship stretches with travel by boat. News now moves along rivers with a grace that walking rarely matched. Songlines pick up riparian verses, eddies that mark turns, reeds that hum in a certain wind, a heron's favorite rock that tells the time of morning when fog lifts. Navigation's ceiling lowers from stars to canopy, then rises again when channels open to sky. The flexibility at the heart of winter travel becomes the signature trait of summer, too. The archive shifts its emphasis. Instead of thick lenses of hearth ash in caves and on windswept benches, there are lakeside middens, shell, fishbone, char, seeds, rings of post holes where houses sink partly into earth to moderate summer heat and winter chill, paths that polish between water and camp like the bright ribs of a new idea. Where sea keeps rising, traces slide seaward and sleep beneath the same archive that swallowed older shores. Where land rebounds faster than water climbs, terraces stack like steps. People climb each generation, revising their doorways to meet the new horizon. The archaeology of absence remains, but its absenteeism takes on different reasons. Wealth changes, moods. A big fish run can feed villages and cousins' cousins. With more to keep, new manners arise, taboos around first catches, ritual openings to ensure that appetite's first surge does not ruin its own season. Potlatch-like logics, give a way to grow rich in allegiance, begin to sketch themselves where resources pulse predictably, converting food into promise, promise into networks that hold steadier than stores alone. Abundance always needs instruction. Winter provided the textbook. Thaw publishes it in longer print. Not all lessons melt cleanly. New diseases ride in with new densities. Forest burns behave differently than grass burns, and control learns the harder syllables of crown fire. The great animals that once arranged landscapes with hoof and tusk and trunk thin and vanish, and their absences ripple through seeds and soils and people's imaginations. Grief returns, not as emergency alone, but as tone. A world subtly altered, asking for revised attention. Some groups follow the receding openness into higher planes, others accept the green and let their tools shrink to fit the interstices. Neither is betrayal. Both are fidelity to place reinvented. The sky still keeps its slow clocks. Precession continues its quiet circle. Tilt audits summer severity. The orbit breathes, the ocean answers. Yet within these overarching measures, winters moderate in many places, and the human heart exhales. Beauty, once a pantry, becomes also a festival. Music travels farther because boats do. Carved memory finds new houses on wood as well as bone and stone. Painted hands still appear, but faces arise more often now, and animals with a different intimacy, caught not only in pursuit, but in coexistence near water and wood. The long thaw within is cautious. It retains the muscle memory of scarcity, and does not brag. It keeps caches small and many. It sets the table for guests who may never arrive, understanding that hospitality is not only for them, but for the host's own survival in a world where generosity attracts allies and wards, off loneliness more efficiently than walls. It leaves room on shelves for the second skin and the travel lamp because weather remains weather, because the planet retains the right to speak in sudden syllables. Evening returns, softer now, smelling of wet earth and leaf. Somewhere, a glacier, still calves, a white thunder rolling down a blue throat, and the reminder arrives, nothing ever ends. It changes. People sit by water that did not exist in the grandparents' time and mend nets that depend on fish that did. They tell winter stories in summer so that children understand the provenance of the ethics that feed them. The thaw, then, is not an escape, but an incorporation. Winter's discipline carried forward as grace, summer's abundance learned without, forgetting the cost of forgetting. They sleep to frog calls and wake to bird song. They measure day by the tilt of sun on water. They still share. They still move. They still hold their breath to listen, counting slowly until patience becomes the easiest thing, until survival feels less like a reaction and more like a style of attention that could fit many climates. The ice recedes beyond the horizon like a lesson taken to heart. The heart keeps it. Night lowers until edges blur. Breath slows. Somewhere far off, a glacier turns in its sleep and the sound travels like a soft thought across water. Lamps dim to blue, then to ember, then to the memory. Of ember, the room holds steady warmth. Outside, a hush settles on grasses and the last ripple on the river smooths into mirror. Stars loosen across the black like seeds. The sky does not ask to be named, it simply waits. A thin wind passes, not cold, not warm, just present. It combs the world and moves on. In its wake, silence gathers itself into a gentle shape, the kind that invites the body to lengthen and the mind to float without urgency. The sea breathes at a distance, an exhale, an inhale, patient and low. A small shore somewhere receives it, sand dark, foam faint. In the margin between wave and land, nothing hurries. Driftwood rests. A gull tucks its head. The moon opens a path and leaves it open. Inland, frost writes its light script along the edge of a pool. A fox pauses on thin ice and then steps away, leaving only the thought of a print. A stand of trees becomes one dark chord against the paler night. The earth is here, wide and listening, and a human heartbeat joins it, steady, unafraid. Questions soften at the edges. They do not need answers. They need room. The room is wide. The sky is wider. Sleep stands just beyond the door and waits without, knocking. Breath meets it halfway, slow and even, carrying the body toward the kind of quiet where memory and wish drift without touching, and both are welcome. Nothing concludes. Everything rests. The river keeps its slow counsel, the sea keeps its longer one, and the stars keep a counsel older than both. In this deep, gentle pause, warmth holds, air clears, and the mind, small, bright, floats like a calm lantern on a dark, friendly tide. End of script. Sleep well.